The federal government is making a deliberate choice, a choice to sacrifice America's largest reservoir to save its upstream twin. And if it fails, the lights go out. Right now, a catastrophic power failure is no longer a worst-case scenario. It is a mathematical certainty, already coded into federal projections. One of the greatest engineering marvels of the 20th century is being pushed toward a cliff, and a state water director in Arizona just went on the record and admitted what everyone in Washington was afraid to say out loud. Catastrophe is not just coming, it is inevitable. So, the real question is this a natural disaster or a man-made one? Let me know in the comments below, because the line is getting blurry. The crisis has already begun. A huge percentage of people who find these stories essential forget to subscribe. If you believe understanding the fragility of our infrastructure is critical, take 1 second and hit that button now. It is the single most important way to support this kind of deep dive reporting, and it guarantees you will not miss what happens next. Let's begin. The number is 1,035 feet. 1035. Burn it into your memory, because it is the number that is keeping engineers in 3 states awake at night. It is not Deadpool. It is something both closer and, in some ways, more insidious. At 1,035 feet above sea level, Lake Mead does not run dry. Hoover Dam does not stop holding back water. But 12 of its 17 turbines will be forced to go silent. That is the point at which physics takes over. The point at which the pressure of the lake is no longer strong enough to protect the machinery that powers cities. The point at which the dam begins to tear itself apart from the inside. They call it cavitation. It is a deceptively simple word for a brutally violent process. Hoover Dam creates electricity through hydraulic head, the immense weight of trillions of gallons of water pressing down, forcing water through giant pipes called penstocks and into the turbines. As the lake level drops, that pressure weakens. At 1,035 feet, the pressure becomes so low that as water rushes into the older turbines, microscopic pockets of air, of nothingness, begin to form. They are just tiny vapor bubbles, harmless, until they collapse. And they collapse with the force of a microscopic depth charge. An implosion so violent it releases a shock wave that can rip hardened steel apart. One bubble is nothing. Millions of bubbles, exploding every second against the blades of a turbine spinning hundreds of times a minute, is catastrophic. It is like being sandblasted with tiny grenades. The turbines are not just damaged, they are shredded, eaten alive by the very water they are meant to control. To prevent this, engineers will have no choice. The moment the lake kisses 1,035 feet, they will initiate a shutdown. 12 turbines, representing the vast majority of Hoover Dam's generating capacity, will go offline. Instantly, the dam's output plunges from over 1,300 megawatts to just 382. In a flash, an energy source for 1.3 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California is gutted. And that crisis point, that 1,035-foot cliff, is no longer a distant threat. As of this morning, June 26, 2026, Lake Mead sits at 1,045.09 feet. 10 feet away, the lake lost nearly 20 feet in the last year alone. The math is not complicated. Tom Bushatsky, the director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, said it plainly in mid-May. We're going to go to 1,035. There's no question that's going to happen. The question is no longer if, it is when. And what happens the day after? The video title you clicked on says 25 million people will lose power. That is not entirely accurate, but the truth is more complicated. Hoover Dam provides electricity to about 1.3 million people. The 25 million figure, that is the number of people who depend on the lake's water. Two different numbers, two different crises, born from the same disappearing lake. The power crisis is the first to arrive, and its biggest victim will be a city hundreds of miles away. So who feels the shockwave when Hoover's capacity is slashed by nearly 75%? What would you do if you were in charge? Keep the comments coming. We read all of them. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, LADWP, is Hoover Dam's single largest customer. They purchase anywhere from 15 to over 20% of the total power generated. For decades, that power has been some of the cheapest, cleanest, most reliable hydroelectricity on the planet. A foundational block of the energy grid that keeps the second largest city in America running. When Hoover's output craters, LADWP does not just get less power. the power they can still get becomes exponentially more expensive. Jordi Fuentes, the head of Arizona's power authority, put it in stark terms. We're basically knocking out most of Hoover's generating capacity. When that happens, the resource becomes unaffordable for most of our customers. Affordability is a sanitized word for what really happens. To replace Hoover's lost gigawatts, utilities will have to buy power on the open spot market. That means burning more natural gas, firing up older, dirtier, and far more expensive peaker plants to meet demand on hot summer afternoons. The cost gets passed on directly to the bills of millions of households and businesses in Southern California and Arizona. The lights might not go out on day one, but keeping them on will suddenly cost a fortune, and every single kilowatt generated will come with a higher carbon price tag. The clean energy promise of the dam, a promise made by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself at its dedication on September 30th, 1935, will be broken by simple hydrology, by a lake that can no longer push hard enough. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that runs the dam, saw this coming. They are not victims of the crisis. They are its architects. In a move that can only be described as hydraulic triage, the Department of the Interior made a calculated decision in early 2026. They decided to save Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam, at the direct expense of Lake Mead. Federal models showed Lake Powell was dangerously close to dropping below its own minimum power pool of 3,490 feet, a drop that would have crippled power generation for communities across Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. So they acted. They cut the annual release of water from Lake Powell downstream to Lake Mead to a historic low, just 6.00 million acre-feet, down from the 7.48 million that was already considered a low baseline. They starved Mead to save Powell. They put one patient on life support by pulling the plug on another. David Palumbo, the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, is now the man managing the fallout of this decision. A decision that made the 1,035-foot crisis at Hoover Dam a near-term certainty. The Bureau's own statement admitted it. This outcome is not a reflection of recent drought response actions, but rather a clear reminder that the Colorado River remains vulnerable. It was an admission of defeat, dressed in the language of bureaucracy. They had chosen a loser, and the loser was Hoover Dam. If you think your friends and family need to see this, need to understand what's really happening to the power grid, hit the like button and share this with them. It makes a real difference. Awareness starts somewhere. But the story of failure is also a story of a desperate, last-minute fight. The engineers at Hoover are not sitting idle, waiting for the cavitation monster to arrive. For years, they have been quietly retrofitting the dam for a future they knew was coming. Between 2011 and 2016, the Bureau of Reclamation spent millions to install 5 brand-new wide-head turbines. These were a different breed of machine. Engineered to operate under far lower hydraulic pressure, they could withstand the forces of cavitation all the way down to a lake elevation of 950 feet. Their installation effectively lowered Hoover Dam's absolute minimum power pool from 1,050 feet to 950 feet. It was a monumental upgrade, an engineering miracle that bought the dam an extra 100 feet of life. And it still was not enough. 5 wide-head turbines meant that 12 of the older, vulnerable turbines remained. As the 1,035-foot power cliff loomed closer and closer in the 2026 projections, the federal government finally blinked. On May 21, 2026, Andrea Travnicek, the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, announced a $52 million emergency investment, an infusion of cash from the Inflation Reduction Act to fast-track the replacement of 3 more of the old turbines with new wide-head models. It is a race against time, a frantic, expensive effort to give the dam a little more breathing room before the lake drops too far. When the work is done, Hoover will have 8 turbines that can fight their way down to 950 feet, but 9 will still go dark. The dam will still lose more than half its generating capacity. The $52 million is not a solution. It is a patch, a tourniquet applied to an arterial bleed. And yet, while the federal government races to patch a dying power source, one city is watching the chaos unfold with an unsettling sense of calm. The one city that should be in the most danger. Las Vegas. While everyone else was panicking about power, Vegas was solving a much bigger problem. The problem of what happens when the water stops entirely. The real dead pool for Lake Mead, The point where gravity itself prevents any water from flowing downstream past the dam is 895 feet. At that level, the canals that feed Arizona's farms and California's cities go dry. It is the doomsday scenario for the entire lower Colorado River Basin. For Las Vegas, it is just another number, because Las Vegas prepared for the end of the world. They spent $1.5 billion and 7 years doing something that sounds like science fiction. They drilled a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock, hundreds of feet beneath the bottom of Lake Mead. They built a third straw, an intake so deep it sits at an elevation of 860 feet. That is 35 feet below Deadpool. Bronson Mack, the spokesman for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency that owns the straw, said it with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush. We invested as a community and built a deep water intake and a low lake level pumping station at Lake Mead. Those two facilities secure our access to our water supply, regardless of what Lake Mead's elevation is. It is one of the most audacious and insulated water security projects in human history. If Lake Mead drops to dead pool, the Hoover Dam's outlets become useless. The water stops flowing to Phoenix. It stops flowing to the Imperial Valley's farms. It stops flowing to Mexico. But inside that tunnel, deep below the now useless dam, a separate $200 million pumping station will turn on, and it will keep pulling water into Las Vegas. The fountains at the Bellagio will keep running, not because the crisis was averted, but because one city paid to build an escape hatch while its neighbors were still arguing about who used the last drop. And if you're still with me, and you haven't subscribed, now is your chance. It is the only way to make sure you see the next chapter in this unfolding story. Don't let the algorithm hide it from you. This whole catastrophe, the power crisis, the water crisis, the desperate engineering, it all has a single point of origin. A mistake made more than a century ago, in 1922. That year, the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin came together to sign the Colorado River Compact. It was a gentleman's agreement to divide the spoils of what seemed like an infinitely generous river. They measured the river's flow, they did the math, and they allocated shares to each state. A share for Arizona, a share for California, for Colorado, for Nevada. There was one fatal flaw in their calculation. The years they used to measure the river's flow, the early 20th century, were some of the wettest years the American West had seen in over a millennium. They built their entire legal framework on a historic anomaly, a weather pattern that was the exception, not the rule. They allocated more water on paper than the river actually produces in a normal year. For decades, it didn't matter. The great reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, were so vast they could absorb the deficit. They acted like a massive bank account, and the states were just drawing down the principal. But you can only do that for so long. The structural deficit, the original sin of the 1922 Compact, quietly compounded for 100 years. That overdraft is now coming due, and there is not enough water in the river to pay it back. The story gets worse. That allocated water, the lifeblood of 25 million people, is not even primarily used for people. Up to 80% of all the water diverted from the Colorado River goes to agriculture. It waters vast fields of cotton, lettuce, and citrus in the middle of the desert. And in one of the most surreal paradoxes of this crisis, a significant portion of that water is used to grow alfalfa, a thirsty crop grown in the deserts of Arizona and California, which is then harvested, baled, and shipped thousands of miles to places like Saudi Arabia and China to be used as feed for cattle. We are, in effect, exporting the water of a dying river system out of the country in the form of hay. It is a detail so absurd it sounds like fiction. It is the documented reality of a system that has lost all connection to its own ecological limits. This is not a story about a simple drought. Scientists have stopped using that word. They now call it aridification, a permanent, long-term shift to a hotter, drier climate. It is not a temporary condition that will be fixed by one good snow year. We saw that illusion play out just recently. The winter of 2022-2023 brought record-breaking snowpack to the Rocky Mountains. Lake Mead, which had fallen to a terrifying 26% of capacity, shot up by more than 20 feet. For a moment, it felt like a reprieve, a miracle. But the experts warned against celebration. One wet year does not erase 2 decades of dryness. And they were right. The recovery was fragile, temporary. By 2025, the dry patterns returned. The lake began its inexorable march back down. That one great snow year was just a gasp of air for a drowning system, not a rescue. Beneath the water, another problem is silently growing, literally. Since its completion in 1935, nearly 100 feet of sediment has built up at the bottom of Lake Mead. Silt, sand, and mud, carried downstream by the Colorado, have settled in the reservoir, slowly but surely reducing its total storage capacity. The bottom of the lake is physically higher than it used to be. Every year, the reservoir dies a little bit from the bottom up. That sediment also changes the math of the bathtub ring, the iconic white band of minerals staining the canyon walls. The ring looks dramatic, but it is also deceiving. Because the lake is shaped like a giant martini glass, a 10-foot drop near the top represents a colossal volume of water. A 10-foot drop near the narrow bottom represents far, far less. As the lake shrinks, each foot of elevation it loses corresponds to a smaller and smaller amount of actual water. The decline accelerates as it gets closer to the bottom. I know, this is probably the third time I'm mentioning it. But it's this important. With the way online platforms are working now, if you are not subscribed, you might genuinely never see the conclusion to this story when the deadline hits. Please, take 1 second. It's right there. It helps more than you can possibly imagine. All of this, the politics, the physics, the history, is now hurtling toward a single date on the calendar. December 31st, 2026. That is the day the current operating rules for the river, the 2007 interim guidelines, officially expire. All the agreements that dictate who gets cut, when, and by how much, simply cease to exist. The 7 basin states, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, are currently locked in the most contentious negotiations in a century. They have to come up with a new plan to share a river that is a shadow of its former self, a plan that will involve brutal, painful, and permanent cuts for everyone. If they fail to reach an agreement by that deadline, the system enters a state of unprecedented chaos. What happens on January 1st, 2027? Does California, with its senior water rights, simply take what it believes it is legally owed, leaving almost nothing for Arizona and Nevada? Do the states sue each other, plunging the entire river system into a legal quagmire that could last for decades while the reservoirs continue to drain? Does the federal government, under a future Secretary of the Interior, have to step in and impose its own solution on unwilling states? No one knows the answer. The rulebook is about to be thrown out, and the game is being played on a board that is shrinking every single day. The title of this video is a hypothetical, a warning of what could happen if the lake drops below the dead pool line of 895 feet. We are not there today. At 1,045 feet, we are still 150 feet above that ultimate doomsday. But we are only 10 feet away from the power cliff, 10 feet away from a crisis that will send economic and electrical shockwaves across the entire Southwest. The dam will not go dark for 25 million people. But the forced shutdown of 12 turbines will cripple the power supply for 1.3 million, and it will set a terrifying precedent. It will be the first time in its 90-year history that the mighty Hoover Dam has been brought to its knees by a lack of water. It is a warning shot, a preview of the much larger catastrophe waiting at 895 feet. A world where the water truly does stop. The engineering that built this system was monumental. It was born of ambition, concrete, and a belief in humanity's ability to tame nature. The third straw beneath Las Vegas is a modern testament to that same spirit, an extraordinary accomplishment. But no amount of engineering can create water that is not there. The tunnel is drilled, the turbines are being replaced, the frantic, last-minute work continues. And all of it is a response to a century-old miscalculation and 2 decades of a climate that has stopped cooperating. The future of the American Southwest is being written right now, in closed-door meetings between water lawyers and in the quiet, relentless evaporation from a shrinking lake. The problem is no longer theoretical. The numbers are on the monthly reports. The crisis is on the horizon. The one question left is whether the solutions will arrive. It is not a crack in the concrete. The new warning from Hoover Dam is not a sound you can hear, or a fracture you can see. It is a memo, a legal document, a quiet, bureaucratic declaration that an entire era of American ambition has come to an end. The dam is about to fail at its 2 primary jobs, delivering stable water and generating reliable electricity. The consequences will not be theoretical. For 40 million people across 7 states, the failure is existential. They live in cities built on a mathematical error made a century ago, a promise of water that the river could never keep. For decades, the dam held the line. It was the concrete manifestation of human control over nature. No longer. The problem is no longer a drought. A drought is temporary. A drought ends. This is a permanent shift in the climate of the American West, a process scientists call aridification, the slow, relentless drying of a landscape. And it means the water that was promised is not just missing, it was never really there to begin with. Before we break down the battle lines being drawn for the water that remains, let me know in the comments, what do you think is the breaking point for the American Southwest? A huge number of people who watch these documentaries and find them valuable are not subscribed. If that's you, take 1 second and hit the button now. It is genuinely the only way we can continue funding this kind of deep dive research. Your click is our lifeblood. It's an emergency for the channel. Let's begin. The entire crisis was born in a hotel room in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The date was November 24, 1922. 7 men, representatives from 7 states, gathered to do something audacious. They were going to divide the water of the Colorado River. The river was wild, unpredictable, and powerful. It carved the Grand Canyon. It flooded entire valleys. But to these men, it represented something else, a resource, an engine for growth, the fuel for a civilization they planned to build in the desert. They negotiated based on the data they had, and the data was wrong. The years leading up to 1922 were some of the wettest in the region's recorded history. The river seemed impossibly abundant. They measured its flow and came up with a number. They decided the river carried over 16 million acre-feet of water each year. Based on that number, they made their deal. The Colorado River Compact. They split the basin in two, an upper basin with Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and a lower basin with California, Arizona, and Nevada. They allocated 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year to each basin. Another 1.5 million was later promised to Mexico, a total of 16.5 million acre-feet. Promised, legally binding. It was a gentleman's agreement written in ink, built on a foundation of sand. Modern paleoclimate research, gleaned from ancient tree rings, tells a different story. The river's true, long-term average flow is closer to 12 or 13 million acre-feet. The men in that room had overestimated the river's generosity by at least 25%. They had promised away water that did not exist. For decades, it didn't seem to matter. They built the infrastructure to prove their point. The crown jewel was Hoover Dam, dedicated on September 30, 1935, by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and later renamed Hoover Dam in 1947. It was an icon of the industrial age, a 726-foot-tall wall of concrete wedged into Black Canyon. It took 5 years, thousands of workers, and more concrete than anyone had ever used on a single project. Its purpose was twofold. First, to tame the river, to stop the floods, and provide a reliable, predictable flow of water downstream. Second, to generate power. Massive turbines spun by the force of the falling water would produce electricity for the growing cities of the Southwest: Los Angeles, Phoenix, a sleepy railroad town in the Mojave Desert called Las Vegas. The dam created Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States by volume, an inland sea holding trillions of gallons of water. It was the system's primary bank account, and for most of the 20th century, the account looked full. The promise of 1922 seemed to be holding. The structural deficit, the gap between what was promised and what the river actually provided, was a quiet problem. An accountant's footnote. We were spending more than we earned, but the savings account was so vast, nobody noticed the slow drain. Cities bloomed. The Imperial Valley in California became the winter salad bowl of America, irrigating 5.5 million acres of farmland with Colorado River water. 90% of the nation's winter vegetables. All of it dependent on that one river. All of it built on that one century-old miscalculation. The dam stood as a testament to human ingenuity, a monument to our ability to rewrite the rules of nature. Then, in the year 2000, nature started rewriting them back. If you've driven to Las Vegas recently, you've seen the scar. A stark, white ring etched into the canyon walls around Lake Mead. It looks like the chalk line of a bathtub after the water has been drained. That line is made of calcium carbonate and other minerals, left behind as the largest reservoir in the country simply vanished into thin air. Each foot of that white stain represents billions of gallons of missing water. By the summer of 2022, the scar had grown to a terrifying size. Lake Mead's water level fell to a historic low of 1,040 feet above sea level, just 27% of its total capacity. The reservoir was not just low, it was hollow. This is where the dam's new warning begins. Not as a political debate, but as a crisis of physics. Hoover Dam is a gravity dam. Its ability to generate power depends on the sheer weight and pressure of the water stacked up behind it. As the lake level drops, the pressure decreases. The turbines spin slower. The power output dwindles. The dam's rated capacity is around 2,080 megawatts, but with the lake at historic lows, its actual output has fallen by a third, often closer to just 1,000 megawatts. The electricity that powers air conditioners in Phoenix and lights on the Las Vegas Strip is flickering. Then there is the cliff, the point of no return. For power generation, that point is 950 feet. It is the minimum power pool elevation. Below this level, the water is too low to turn the turbines effectively. The dam stops being a power plant, entirely. Another 55 feet below that is the number that keeps water managers awake at night, 895 feet. This is dead pool. At this elevation, the water level is below the dam's lowest outlets. Water can no longer flow past the dam through the power of gravity. It stops being a river. It stops being a reservoir. It becomes a landlocked, stagnant lake. The water delivery system for 40 million people shuts down. In 2022, the lake was just 145 feet above that dead pool line, and falling fast. What do you think is a fair price to pay for water in the desert? Let me know in the comments below. The receding water told a story that numbers alone could not. Sunken boats from decades past slowly emerged from the depths, their hulls caked in mud. One was a Higgins landing craft, a World War II-era vessel that had sunk decades ago, now beached on the dry shore. The ghost town of St. Thomas, Nevada, submerged since 1938 when the lake was first filled, reappeared. Its stone foundations and old streets were once again walkable, a town resurrected by drought. Then came the bodies. In May of 2022, a barrel containing human remains was discovered stuck in the mud. Homicide investigators believed the victim was a casualty of Las Vegas's mob-run past, likely killed in the 1970s or 80s, and dumped in the lake. Weeks later, more remains were found, and then more. The lake was giving up its darkest secrets. It was a grim, potent metaphor. The crisis wasn't just exposing a water shortage, it was unearthing the buried sins of the past. The federal government, the ultimate owner and operator of the dam, decided it had seen enough. On June 14, 2022, Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner Camille Kalimlim Touton sat before the U.S. Senate and delivered an ultimatum. It was a moment that shattered a century of careful diplomacy. Touton stated, in no uncertain terms, that the 7 basin states had 60 days to come up with a plan to cut their water use by an unprecedented 2 to 4 million acre-feet. To put that number in perspective, 2 million acre-feet is more than the entire annual allocation for Arizona and Nevada combined. She was asking for a cut so deep, so severe, it had never been contemplated. And she added a threat. If the states couldn't agree on how to make the cuts, the federal government would impose them. The warning was no longer a projection from scientists. It was a deadline from the people in charge. The decades of kicking the can down the road were over. If this story is opening your eyes to the scale of the crisis, take a moment to hit the like button. And if you have family in the Southwest, this is information they need to have. Share it with them. The reaction was immediate. Panic, followed by finger-pointing. The states of the Colorado River Basin, which had maintained a fragile alliance for a century, turned on each other. The core of the conflict comes down to a concept 100 years old, the law of the river. It's a complex web of compacts, court decrees, and regulations, but it boils down to one simple, brutal fact. Some states have better water rights than others. At the top of the pyramid is California, represented in negotiations by figures like J.B. Hamby, chairman of the Colorado River Board of California. California holds the most senior water rights in the lower basin. It is entitled to 4.4 million acre-feet of water, and under the old laws, it gets its full share before other, more junior states get a single drop. The single largest user of all is his own agency, the Imperial Irrigation District, which alone uses more water than all of Arizona and Nevada combined. Their position was clear. We have the oldest, strongest legal rights. We are not the ones who need to sacrifice first. At the bottom of the lower basin hierarchy is Arizona. Tom Bushatsky, director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, found himself in an impossible position. Arizona has junior rights compared to California. When the federal government declared the first ever Tier 2A shortage for 2023, it was Arizona that bore the brunt of the pain. The state was forced to cut 592,000 acre-feet from its supply, a staggering 21% of its total annual apportionment. Farmers in central Arizona saw their irrigation canals run dry. Fields that had been productive for generations went fallow. Caught in the middle was Nevada, a state that uses the least amount of water but is arguably the most vulnerable. John Ensminger, the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, has been one of the most blunt voices in the entire debate. His city, Las Vegas, gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead. For him, the crisis is not abstract. He has been a vocal proponent of aggressive, shared sacrifice, arguing for years that the old math no longer applies. As he put it plainly, what we've seen to date is a 23-year period of time where the river has produced about 12.3 million acre-feet a year. That's the river we have. We can't continue to try to take 15 million acre-feet out of it. The 60-day deadline came and went. The states failed to produce a plan. The civil war over water had begun. I know this is the second time I'm asking, but it's that important. Our subscriber numbers are low compared to our viewership, and every single click makes a monumental difference. If you've been watching this far, you clearly find this important. Please, take 1 second and make it official. The future of this channel depends on it. After months of bitter, closed-door negotiations, a temporary truce was reached. In May 2023, the 3 lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada, did something remarkable. They submitted a joint proposal. They agreed to voluntarily conserve an additional 3 million acre-feet of water through the end of 2026. It was a landmark act of cooperation, a step back from the brink. But the deal came with a massive asterisk. The conservation wasn't based on sacrifice alone. It was enabled by money. The federal government, through the Inflation Reduction Act, made $4 billion available specifically to pay farmers and cities to use less water. Farmers in the Imperial Valley would be paid to fallow fields. Cities would get funds to expand conservation programs. It was, in effect, a bailout, a way to buy a few years of peace without solving the underlying conflict. Because the old rules, the 1922 Compact, and the 2007 interim guidelines that govern the river, are all set to expire at the end of 2026. Everyone knows a new agreement is needed, one that reflects the new, drier reality. And now, the battle is over what that new reality will look like. In March of 2024, the truce officially shattered. The 7 states failed to agree on a unified path forward. Instead, they submitted 2 competing, fundamentally opposed plans to the federal government. This is the new front line. The lower basin states, led by California, proposed a plan where future cuts are tied primarily to one thing: the water level in the reservoirs. When Lake Mead and Lake Powell dropped to certain trigger elevations, specific, pre-agreed cuts would automatically kick in for everyone. Their logic is that keeping the lakes as full as possible is the #1 priority, providing a buffer against multi-year droughts. It's a plan that favors taking larger cuts earlier to protect the system's savings accounts. The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, submitted a completely different vision. They argue that cuts can't just be based on reservoir levels. They must also be based on real-time hydrology, how much snow actually falls, and how much water actually flows into the river each year. They fear the lower basin's plan would allow California, Arizona, and Nevada to drain the reservoirs for their own use, and then trigger cuts that would unfairly penalize the upper basin, forcing them to send down water they are legally entitled to use under the 1922 Compact. Becky Mitchell, Colorado's top water negotiator, didn't mince words. She called the lower basin's proposal inconsistent with the law of the river, and inequitable. The battle lines are drawn. Is the river a shared resource where pain must be distributed based on the physical reality of the water available? Or is it a system governed by a century-old pecking order of legal rights, where some are entitled to their share no matter how little water is left for others? In April 2024, the Bureau of Reclamation responded. They released a preliminary analysis of the two competing plans. They pointedly did not endorse either one. Instead, the agency laid out a process for a formal environmental review. The unspoken message was the same one Camille Touton delivered in 2022, only louder: find a compromise. Or, we will write the rules for you. The clock is ticking toward 2026. A federal sledgehammer is hanging over 7 states that cannot agree on how to share a river that is actively disappearing. Just as the crisis seemed to be reaching a political boiling point, the sky opened up. The winter of 2022-2023 was one for the record books. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the source of the Colorado River, was immense. As it melted, a surge of water poured into the system. Lake Powell, upstream of Hoover Dam, rose by more than 50 feet. Lake Mead climbed by over 20 feet, rising back to around 1,075 feet, or 34% capacity. The following winter, 2023-24, was also blessedly wet. In May of 2024, the Bureau of Reclamation announced that, thanks to the improved conditions, no shortage declaration would be needed for 2025. The mandatory cuts that had crippled Arizona farmers were paused. On the surface, it looked like a miracle, a reprieve, a sign that the drought was breaking. But climate scientists like Brad Udall of Colorado State University were quick to warn this was a dangerous illusion. 1 or 2 good snow years, they explained, cannot erase 2 decades of compounded water debt. The structural deficit remains. The climate trend of aridification remains. The simple fact that demand exceeds supply remains. The wet winters didn't solve the problem. They merely postponed the day of reckoning, and in a dangerous way. The temporary relief has taken the political pressure off, making it even harder for the states to agree on the painful, long-term cuts that are still absolutely necessary. It's like finding a $100 bill in the wallet of a bankrupt company. It feels good for a moment, but it doesn't change the fundamental balance sheet. The bankruptcy is still coming. And this gets to the real heart of the conflict, the choice that no politician wants to make. The fight over the Colorado River is often framed as a battle between sprawling cities and environmental needs. But that's not the whole story. The biggest user of water, by an overwhelming margin, is agriculture. Between 70 and 80% of all the water in the river is used to irrigate 5.5 million acres of farmland. Much of this happens in California's Imperial Valley, home to the Imperial Irrigation District. This single district is the largest user of Colorado River water, larger than Arizona, larger than Nevada, larger than all the cities combined. It's here that America grows about 90% of its winter vegetables: lettuce, broccoli, spinach. This water doesn't just fill swimming pools in Scottsdale. It puts food on tables in Chicago. But it also grows enormously water-intensive crops, like alfalfa, a thirsty plant grown primarily as feed for cattle. An enormous portion of the Colorado River's precious water is used to grow food for cows, in the middle of a desert, during a megadrought. This creates an impossible dilemma. If you cut water to agriculture, you risk disrupting the nation's food supply and bankrupting farming communities that have existed for a century. But if you don't, where do the cuts come from? How do you tell the 40 million people in Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, and Las Vegas that their taps might run dry so a field of alfalfa can be watered? This is the decision that the federal government may soon have to make. Food or faucets? There is no clean answer. Any significant cut to agriculture has cascading effects. For example, the Salton Sea, California's largest lake, is a terminal saline lake that is almost entirely sustained by agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley. As farmers use less water, or use it more efficiently, less water flows into the Salton Sea. As it shrinks, its toxic lakebed is exposed to the wind, creating clouds of hazardous dust that threaten the health of nearby communities. Solving one problem creates another. Okay, I promise, this is the last time. It might feel weird that I'm asking again, but the data is just brutal. The vast majority of people watching right now, who've made it this deep into the story, are not subscribed. If you've ever thought, I should subscribe to this channel, please let this be the moment you do it. One click. That's all. It changes everything for us. Thank you. The Hoover Dam stands today, a masterpiece of 20th century engineering confronting a 21st century catastrophe. The concrete is sound. The turbines are ready. The engineering is not the problem. The math is the problem. A civilization was built in the desert on a promise of water the river could not keep. For a century, we got away with it, draining the system's savings account, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, to cover our annual deficit. Now, the account is nearly empty, and the bill has come due. The engineering marvels of the past can only do so much. Las Vegas spent over $1 billion to build its third straw, a low lake-level pumping station designed to suck water from the very bottom of Lake Mead, an engineering feat that should guarantee their supply. But even that has its limits. That straw pulls water at 860 feet of elevation. What happens if the lake drops below that? It becomes the world's most expensive hole, drilled into a dry lake bed. The system is now at a genuine tipping point. Two factions of states are locked in a Cold War, with competing visions for the future that are, right now, irreconcilable. The lower basin wants to protect reservoir levels at all costs. The upper basin wants to protect their legal rights to the water that originates in their mountains. Both arguments have merit. Both sides believe they are fighting for their survival. And hovering over all of it is the federal government, which has made its position clear. Agree by 2026, or we will impose a solution. No one knows what a federally imposed solution would look like, but it would almost certainly involve deep, painful cuts for everyone, rewriting a century of law and custom by executive order. As Brad Udall, one of the foremost experts on the river, has said, the decisions that are being made are fundamentally about how to transition from a 20th century river, which we can no longer have, to a 21st century river, which is a smaller river. Hoover Dam's new warning is not about a single drought or a low water year. It is a sign that the entire operating system of the American Southwest has to be rebooted. The monument that once symbolized humanity's complete control over its environment now symbolizes the hard limits of that control. The engineering bought us time. The infrastructure gave us a century of unprecedented growth in a place that should never have supported it. But the engineering cannot make it rain. The infrastructure cannot create water that isn't there. The question is no longer if the system built in 1922 will be dismantled. It is already happening. The only question left is what the United States government is being forced to intentionally sabotage one of its greatest engineering achievements, not with explosives, not with an attack, but with water. Right now, federal operators are deliberately starving Hoover Dam, choking off its water supply in a desperate attempt to save its sister dam upstream from a catastrophic failure. The result is a technological cliff, a line drawn in the water at 1,035 feet above sea level. And Lake Mead is about to cross it. When it does, power generation for 1.3 million people plummets by 70%, not a gradual decline, an overnight collapse. Think about the city you live in. Imagine 70% of its electricity just vanishing tomorrow. That's the reality they are now planning for. What do you think your community would do if it faced losing most of its power overnight? Let me know in the comments. And a quick note. A huge number of people who watch these documentaries and find them valuable forget to subscribe. It makes a massive difference for us to keep making them. If you get any value from this, please take 1 second to hit that button. It's the single most important thing you can do to support this channel. It's an emergency, and it's important that you subscribe. Let's begin. The plan being executed is a frantic race against time. In May of 2026, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation unlocked $52 million for an emergency hardware replacement. Engineers are now working to physically rip out the colossal 90-year-old turbines inside Hoover Dam and bolt in brand new ones, all while the lake that feeds them continues to drain toward the point of no return. It should be a story of American ingenuity, a last-minute save. But here's the part they aren't advertising. This desperate, expensive fix isn't even designed to solve the problem. It's a band-aid on a broken system. Because the real crisis that terrifies federal water managers is happening upstream, at a dam facing its own unique form of self-destruction. And the final deadline isn't a water level, it's a date on a calendar. December 31st, 2026, the day the rules that govern the entire Colorado River and the survival of 40 million Americans simply expire. This isn't a story about a drought anymore. It's a story about a system that is beginning to fail by design. The crisis facing Hoover Dam was born 100 years ago from a lie written on paper, a gentleman's agreement that the desert was never a party to. The year was 1922. The place was the Colorado River Basin. 7 states, desperate to fuel the growth of the American West, gathered to divide the river's water. They signed a document known as the Colorado River Compact. It was a landmark piece of legislation. Visionary, ambitious, and it was built on a catastrophic miscalculation. The negotiators decided to allocate 15 million acre-feet of water per year, 7.5 million for the upper basin states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, and 7.5 million for the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. That number, 15 million acre-feet, was based on river flow measurements taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. It was a historical anomaly, a decade of incredible, unbelievable luck. Even then, scientists like E.C. LaRue of the U.S. Geological Survey warned them the math was wrong, that the river's true average flow was closer to 15.2 million acre-feet in total, not the 18 million they assumed. They ignored him. The politics of growth demanded more water than the river could give, and so they promised it anyway. That original sin, that structural deficit, has been compounding ever since. For decades, the lie held. Hoover Dam rose from the Black Canyon, a monument of concrete and steel completed in 1936, creating Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the nation. It was a symbol of America's ability to tame nature, to bend the desert to its will. Then, in 1963, its sister rose upstream, Glen Canyon Dam, pinning back the Colorado to create the second largest reservoir, Lake Powell. Together, they were the hydraulic battery of the Southwest, storing water, generating power, and underwriting the existence of cities like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. They were masterpieces of engineering built upon a foundation of bad math. The river was already over-allocated from the day the compact was signed. For most of the 20th century, nature was forgiving. But starting in the early 2000s, a new reality began to set in, a mega-drought. Not a dry year, but a dry generation. The forgiving years were over. The water debt, accumulating for a century, was finally coming due, and the 2 great reservoirs built to protect the Southwest were now being turned against each other in a desperate game of survival. What happens when the foundational document holding your civilization together is based on a mistake? It's a question these states have avoided for a century, and now the river is forcing an answer. Let us know in the comments how you think this will play out. The logic seems insane. To save a system, you must break a key part of it. That is exactly what the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is now forced to do. This isn't a guess. It is their stated operational strategy. They are sacrificing Lake Mead to protect Lake Powell. Every day, David Palumbo, the Deputy Commissioner of Operations, overseeing 492 dams, has to make a choice, and the choice is to intentionally hold back water that would normally flow from Glen Canyon Dam down to Hoover Dam. They are drawing down America's largest reservoir to keep its second largest reservoir from hitting a point of complete structural failure. This is the dam triaging game, a brutal equation where saving one asset actively endangers another. I can't be the only one who thinks it's insane that our modern world relies on a system like this. If you agree, or even if you don't, hit that like button. And if you think a friend or family member needs to understand what's unfolding, share this with them. The more people who understand this, the better. The reason for this desperate gambit lies in a threat many have never even heard of, a physics problem called cavitation. Lake Powell, the reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam, is dropping toward its own crisis point, an elevation of 490 feet, known as the minimum power pool. Below this level,
The main turbines that generate electricity can no longer operate. Water for the lower basin states would have to be sent through a different set of pipes near the bottom of the dam. They are called the river outlet works. They are, for all intents and purposes, bypass tubes. And they have a potentially lethal design flaw. These tubes were never designed for sustained, high-volume use. Pushing that much water through them at that pressure creates a phenomenon where air bubbles form and collapse with explosive force. This is cavitation. It's like thousands of tiny hammer blows happening microseconds apart directly against the steel and concrete lining of the dam's internal plumbing. Over time, cavitation doesn't just erode the infrastructure, it tears it apart. It can shred steel pipes and pulverize concrete from the inside out. If the river outlet works at Glen Canyon Dam were to fail due to cavitation damage, the ability to deliver any water downstream to Lake Mead, to California, to Arizona, to Nevada, could be compromised. Not just a reduction in flow, a complete stoppage. So the Bureau of Reclamation is in a bind. Do they let Lake Powell drop, risk the cavitation time bomb, and potentially lose the ability to send water downstream at all? Or do they hold water back in Lake Powell to keep it above the 3,490-foot danger zone, and in doing so, accelerate the draining of Lake Mead and push Hoover Dam toward its own cliff? They have chosen the latter. It is the lesser of two apocalypses. Every gallon of water held in Lake Powell is a gallon that does not arrive in Lake Mead. The sacrifice is deliberate, it is calculated, and the consequences are now arriving at the foot of Hoover Dam. In June of 2026, Lake Powell's capacity had fallen to a terrifying 26%. The USPR's own projections, published in their May 2026 24-month study, showed that the reservoir could hit that minimum power pool of 3,490 feet as early as December 2026. For the first time in history, the lights could go out at Glen Canyon Dam. UNLV hydrology professor David Creamer put it bluntly, "It's a desperate time on the Colorado River," he said. And the decision to hold back water, he noted, was one way to stave off total disaster. A disaster at Glen Canyon would mean no water for anyone. A disaster at Hoover means a power crisis. To the federal government, the choice is grim, but clear. Starve the power to save the water. This deliberate sacrifice upstream creates a new crisis downstream. A number: 1,035 feet. That elevation, 1,035 feet above sea level, is the technological cliff for Hoover Dam. It is not a gradual slope. It is a hard stop, a point at which the fundamental physics of hydropower generation begin to break down. Hoover Dam was built with 17 massive main turbines. 12 of them, the workhorses of the system, were simply not engineered to operate efficiently if the surface of Lake Mead drops below that line. The issue is water pressure, or what engineers call head. The height of the water column sitting above the turbines dictates the pressure pushing down on them. As the lake level falls, that pressure decreases. Below 1,035 feet, the pressure becomes so low that the old turbines can no longer spin effectively. They begin to vibrate, to strain, to operate outside of their design tolerance in a way that risks damaging them permanently. The result is not a small dip in output. It is a collapse. Power capacity would plummet by 70%, from 1,302 megawatts down to just 382 megawatts. Gone, in an instant. That is enough electricity to power entire cities, just switched off. This isn't a distant theoretical problem. The dam is racing toward that number right now. The lake's historic low, hit in July 2022, was 1,040 feet, just 5 feet above the cliff. By June of 2026, the lake sat at approximately 1,048 feet, but with the deliberate water restrictions from upstream, the trajectory is clear. Tom Bushotsky, Arizona's chief water negotiator, stated it with chilling certainty. "We're going to go to 1,035, he said. There's no question that's going to happen. The federal government knows it too. And that knowledge has triggered an unprecedented emergency response. It's a story of how bureaucratic red tape nearly prevented the rescue. For years, there was money available for this exact kind of upgrade, but it was trapped in a legislative loophole, stuck in an old post-retirement benefit fund that the Bureau of Reclamation legally could not touch. It took a literal act of Congress, the Help Hoover Dam Act of 2026, championed by Nevada politicians like Senator Catherine Cortez Masto and Representative Susie Lee, just to give the engineers permission to spend the money to save their own dam. On May 24, 2026, the Department of the Interior, under Assistant Secretary Andrea Travnicek, finally unlocked it. $52 million. I know this is the second time I'm asking, but a lot of us are so focused on the story we forget to support the channel. If you're finding this fascinating, please pause for a second and hit subscribe. It's a small click that makes a huge impact, and it's the only way we know you want more of this content. That money is now funding a desperate race to bolt on new hardware. The plan is to rip out 3 of the oldest turbines and replace them with new wide-head models. These are a marvel of modern engineering, specifically designed to operate under the low-pressure conditions that would cripple the old ones. They cost between $8 and $13 million each. They are the technological band-aid. These new turbines will allow Hoover Dam to continue generating at least 160 megawatts of power, even if water levels drop all the way to 950 feet, the absolute minimum power pool where any electricity generation is possible. This isn't a plan for recovery, it's a plan for failure. It's the government admitting they expect the lake to fall to levels once considered unthinkable, and they are spending millions just to ensure it's not a complete blackout, but a managed one. This entire operation is not a proactive upgrade, it is an emergency retrofit, a frantic attempt to engineer their way around a crisis they can no longer prevent. And they are only replacing 3 of the 17 turbines. The power cliff at 1,035 feet remains. The 70% drop is still coming. The new turbines just ensure that the fall doesn't go all the way to 0. The problem with engineering your way out of a crisis is that sometimes the biggest threat isn't made of concrete and steel. It's made of paper and ink. While engineers race to install new turbines, a far more intractable problem looms. The entire legal framework that has governed the Colorado River for the last 2 decades is about to vanish. On December 31st, 2026, the 2007 Colorado River Interim Guidelines will expire. These are not just guidelines, they are the binding operational rules that dictate how much water is released from Lake Powell, how shortages are shared between the states, and what trigger points mandate cuts. After December 31st, they are gone. The entire basin will be operating without a rulebook for the first time in a generation, during the worst drought in a millennium. The federal government saw this cliff coming. They gave the 7 basin states a deadline. February 14, 2026. Come to an agreement, they said. Propose a unified plan for the post-2026 world. Share the pain. Figure it out. And the states failed. The deadline came and went in a cloud of bitter disagreement. Instead of one plan, the Bureau of Reclamation received 2. One from the upper basin states and a completely separate, competing proposal from the lower basin states. The 2 sides were, and are, deadlocked. California, represented by its lead negotiator J.B. Hamby, holds the oldest and largest water rights on the river. They argue that under the century-old law of the river, they should be the last to face cuts. The upper basin states argue the opposite. They claim the lower basin has been overusing water for decades and must now bear the brunt of the reductions to bring the system back into balance. Arizona, led by negotiator Tom Bushatsky, is caught in the middle, often forced to take the first and deepest cuts under the current rules. The division is not academic. It is a fight over trillions of dollars in economic activity, over the future of agriculture, and over the viability of major American cities. Into this deadlock steps the federal government, led by the new Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum. Their message, delivered repeatedly by Acting USPR Commissioner Scott J. Cameron, is one of exasperated patience. We offered you a chance to solve this yourselves, they are saying. Now, we may have to solve it for you. Cameron, speaking at a tense Senate oversight hearing on June 10, 2026, tried to strike a conciliatory tone, telling the states, "I'm at least trying to help you," as is the entire administration. But the iron fist inside the velvet glove is obvious. If the states cannot agree, the Department of the Interior will impose its own water-cutting plan. Such a move would be unprecedented. It would almost certainly trigger a decade of lawsuits, plunging the entire region into a state of legal chaos at the exact moment that environmental stability is at its lowest point. The political theater is amplifying the tension. In June 2026, just as the negotiations reached a fever pitch, a new commissioner was confirmed to lead the Bureau of Reclamation. Her name is Aubrey Betancourt, a third-generation California farmer nominated to lead the very agency that may have to force her own state and others to give up immense amounts of water. She walks into an impossible situation. The states are divided. The federal government is threatening intervention, and the river itself keeps shrinking, rendering all of their political fights increasingly moot. We are not just running out of water. We are running out of rules. The engineering at Hoover Dam can only buy a little bit of time. It cannot solve a political and legal breakdown a century in the making. The clock is ticking toward a deadline that has nothing to do with megawatts or water elevations, and everything to do with the simple turning of a calendar page. So, where does this all lead? All the threads, the engineering, the politics, the climate science, are converging on a single, unavoidable future. The crisis is no longer an if, it is a how soon. The Bureau of Reclamation's own grim forecast, the May 2026 24-month study, projects that Lake Mead could plummet to 1,021 feet by the summer of 2027. That is 20 feet below its previous historic low. It is 14 feet past the 1,035-foot power cliff. This is not a worst-case scenario from an environmental group. This is the official baseline projection from the agency that manages the dam. It is an admission that the 70% power collapse is now the most likely outcome. It is a future they are actively planning for. The emergency turbine replacement is not a sign of hope. It is a sign of resignation. It is an acknowledgement that the system will fail, and they are simply trying to manage the severity of that failure. Okay, I know this is the third time, and you're probably thinking this guy again, but humor me. Many of you are still here, which means you're getting some value from this. If so, a quick tap on the subscribe button is unbelievably helpful. It's the best way to vote for more documentaries like this one. Thanks for your patience. The competing crises feed on each other. The desperate need to save Glen Canyon Dam from cavitation accelerates the power failure at Hoover Dam. The political deadlock over post-2026 rules makes any long-term, cooperative solution impossible. And all of it unfolds under the shadow of a climate that is getting hotter and drier, making the original sin of the 1922 Compact more glaring with each passing year. We are watching a system unravel in slow motion, a civilization built in the desert on a 100-year-old promise of water that was never really there. The new turbines at Hoover Dam are a technological marvel, a testament to our ability to innovate under pressure. But they are a marvel being bolted onto a 90-year-old structure to survive a water deficit created by a 100-year-old political mistake during a legal crisis with a deadline of less than a year. The question is no longer whether we can engineer a solution. The question is whether any engineering can solve a problem this fundamentally broken. The turbines are being replaced. The deadlines are expiring. The politicians are fighting over a shrinking pie. But the river itself does not negotiate.
The Hoover Dam is a 900-foot-tall battery holding back the American Southwest, and that battery is dying. For nearly a century, it has tamed one of the world's most unpredictable rivers, turning water into light for millions. It was a monument to what a nation could build. A symbol of control. But the water that gives it power has been steadily disappearing for 2 decades. The pressure is falling. The turbines are slowing down. Right now, the dam is operating nearly a third below its maximum capacity. That is not a forecast. That is a fact. And if the decline continues, the lights could go out. Not a brownout, not a rolling blackout, a permanent shutdown. Before we go any further, I have a question for you. What's the single biggest source of power for your city? A lot of people don't know. Let me know in the comments. The story you're about to hear is about more than a dam. It's about a system on the verge of failure. A shocking number of people watch these documentaries and find them valuable, but forget to subscribe. If this is the kind of story you want to see more of, Please hit that subscribe button now. It's the single most important way to support the channel and ensure we can keep making them for you. It takes 1 second. Alright, let's begin. The Hoover Dam was never supposed to be just a dam. It was an act of defiance, an answer to the Great Depression, a concrete fist punching back at nature and economic collapse all at once. In the early 1930s, as the nation's economy disintegrated, the government greenlit a project so audacious it bordered on fantasy. Build the largest dam in human history, in the middle of a barren desert canyon, to harness a river so violent it was known as the Red Bull of the Colorado. The challenge fell to a man named Frank Crowe, the chief engineer for a consortium of construction firms called Six Companies, Inc. Crowe was a legend, a man who lived by the motto, "Never say no to a job, no matter how tough." And this job was the toughest he would ever face. The Black Canyon of the Colorado River was an unforgiving place. Summer temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The canyon walls were sheer, treacherous cliffs. The river itself was a monster, prone to flash floods that could wipe out years of work in a single afternoon. To build the dam, Crowe's crews first had to divert the entire Colorado River. They blasted 4 massive tunnels, each 56 feet in diameter, through the solid rock of the canyon walls. It was a brutal, dangerous process. Carbon monoxide from the truck exhausts filled the unventilated tunnels, leading to sickness and death. But the work never stopped. Crowe ran the site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pushing his men and his equipment to their absolute limits. Then came the concrete. The dam required a volume of material so vast it defied easy comparison, over 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York City. But you couldn't just pour it all at once. The chemical reaction of concrete curing generates immense heat. A single, continuous pour would have generated so much heat that it would have taken over 125 years to cool, and the resulting stress would have cracked the entire structure into pieces. It would have failed before it was even finished. So Frank Crowe and his engineers devised a solution as ingenious as it was massive. They built the dam not as a single monolith, but as a series of interlocking concrete blocks. And inside those blocks, they embedded a network of steel pipes, over 582 miles of them. It was a giant circulatory system. They pumped icy river water through these pipes, drawing the heat out of the curing concrete, essentially building a refrigerator the size of a mountain. It was an engineering feat that had never been attempted at this scale, and it worked. The dam was completed in 1936, 2 years ahead of schedule and under budget. A titan of steel and concrete, ready to hold back the river and fuel the growth of the American West for a century. It seemed perfect. It seemed permanent. It was not permanent. It was never meant to be. Because the entire magnificent structure, all the concrete, all the turbines, all the power lines stretching out into the desert, was built on a mathematical error. A single, catastrophic miscalculation made a decade before a single worker ever set foot in Black Canyon. And that error is now coming due. Is it possible that the entire modern history of the Southwest was built on a foundation of wishful thinking? Let me know what you think in the comments. The year was 1922. Representatives from 7 states gathered to sign a document called the Colorado River Compact. Its purpose was to divide the river's water, to allocate a finite resource among a growing population. They agreed to portion out 15 million acre-feet of water per year. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water, about 326,000 gallons. A number so large it becomes abstract. The compact was a gentleman's agreement to share the river's bounty. The problem was, the bounty wasn't real. The river's flow was measured during an abnormally wet period in the region's history, a handful of decades that we now know were some of the wettest in the last 1,200 years. The average flow of the Colorado River isn't 15 million acre-feet. It's closer to 12 or 13 million, sometimes less. The system was designed with a structural deficit from day one. It promised more water than nature could deliver. For decades, this didn't matter. The massive reservoirs of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir upstream, acted as giant savings accounts. One wet year could cover the deficit of a dry one. The system had a buffer, but starting in the year 2000, that buffer began to disappear. The American Southwest entered a period of intense, prolonged drought. A mega drought, supercharged by climate change, that has now stretched for more than 2 decades. Rising temperatures mean more of the Rocky Mountain snowpack, the river's primary source, evaporates before it can even melt and reach the river. The soil is drier, so it soaks up more runoff. The air is hotter, so more water evaporates directly from the reservoirs themselves. Around 1.2 million acre-feet of water, 4 times Nevada's entire annual allotment, simply vanishes into the desert air every single year. The result has been a slow, steady, relentless decline. If you visit Lake Mead today, you can see the story written on the canyon walls, a stark white band of mineral deposits, a geological scar tracing the high water mark. This bathtub ring is over 150 feet tall. That is the height of a 15-story building. That is how much the lake has fallen from its peak in July of 1983. That is a reservoir hollowing out from the inside. This isn't just an aesthetic problem, it's a physics problem. The Hoover Dam generates electricity through hydropower. Water from the lake flows through massive pipes called penstocks, spinning 17 giant turbines. The amount of power it can generate is directly tied to a principle called hydraulic head. It's the vertical distance between the lake's surface and the turbines. The higher the water, the more pressure, the more force pushing on the turbines, and the more electricity they can generate. As Lake Mead drops, the hydraulic head decreases. The water has less force, the turbines spin slower, the power output dwindles. The dam becomes a weaker and weaker battery. The dam has a maximum power capacity of 2,074 megawatts, enough to supply power for an estimated 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But at today's water levels, around 1,074 feet above sea level, its capacity is down by roughly 500 to 600 megawatts. That is the equivalent of a large natural gas power plant being switched off. Power that cities and industries have relied upon for generations is simply gone. If this story is hitting you, do us a favor and hit the like button. And if you have family or friends in the Southwest, or anywhere that relies on a single fragile resource, share it with them. This is a story everyone needs to understand. Water managers have 3 numbers that they watch with a kind of religious terror. The first is 1,229 feet. That's the elevation of Lake Mead when it's considered full, the system working as intended. The second number is 950 feet. This is the minimum power pool elevation. Below this level, the water pressure is too low to spin the main turbines. They can still generate some power with smaller units, but the dam's ability to function as a major regional power source effectively ends. 950 feet is the line where the lights start to flicker. The final number is 895 feet. This is dead pool. At this elevation, the water level is below the lowest outlet in the dam. Water can no longer flow downstream to supply California, Arizona, and Mexico. The power is gone. The water is gone. The Hoover Dam, the monumental symbol of humanity's command over nature, becomes nothing more than a concrete plug in a canyon, holding back a stagnant, inaccessible pond. In the summer of 2022, Lake Mead's water level fell to a terrifying 1,040 feet, its lowest point since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s. It was just 90 feet above the minimum power pool. It was 145 feet above dead pool. The unthinkable was no longer theoretical. It was on the horizon. The crisis forced a confrontation that had been simmering for a century. For decades, the states had kicked the can down the road, relying on full reservoirs to mask the fundamental error of the 1922 compact. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. In June of 2022, the federal government issued an ultimatum. The commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Camille Kalamlim-Touton, stood before the Senate and delivered a message that sent shockwaves across the West. She said the 7 basin states had 60 days to come up with a plan to voluntarily cut their water use by an astounding 2 to 4 million acre-feet. If they didn't, she warned, the federal government would impose cuts itself. It was an unprecedented threat, the federal government telling sovereign states how much water they could use. The states scrambled. The negotiations were brutal. The battle lines were drawn along a century of water law, where your rights depend on when you claimed them. The Imperial Valley in Southern California holds some of the oldest, most senior water rights on the entire river. They are legally entitled to more water than Arizona and Nevada combined. Arizona, through its 336-mile-long Central Arizona Project Canal, holds junior rights. That means in a shortage, they get cut first and hardest. Nevada, with the smallest allocation of all, was already a world leader in water conservation. John Ensminger, the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, put it bluntly. He said the system had propped up an economically unsustainable agricultural system in the desert. He called the century since the 1922 compact a century of magical thinking. The fight exposed the uncomfortable truth of the Colorado River. About 80% of its water doesn't go to homes, pools, or golf courses in cities like Las Vegas or Phoenix. It goes to agriculture. Much of it to grow water-intensive crops like alfalfa and hay, which are then used for cattle feed, some of which is exported overseas. The West was using a disappearing river to grow food for cows in other countries. It was a system that made sense when water was believed to be infinite. In a world of shrinking reservoirs, it started to look like madness. The states missed the 60-day deadline. The finger-pointing was intense. But as the lake continued to drop, a strange consensus began to emerge. The alternative to a deal was chaos. Lawsuits that could drag on for years while the system collapsed. Finally, in May 2023, California, Arizona, and Nevada announced a landmark deal. They agreed to voluntarily conserve 3 million acre-feet of water through 2026. In exchange, the federal government would pay them over $1 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. Essentially, the government paid farmers and water districts not to use water they were legally entitled to. It was a temporary truce, a multi-billion-dollar band-aid on a gaping wound. It pulled the system back from the brink, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. The river was still over-allocated, the climate was still getting hotter, and the temporary deal was set to expire in 2026. As the water receded, Lake Mead began to give up its darkest secrets. The dropping shoreline didn't just reveal old foundations and submerged roads. It revealed bodies. In May of 2022, boaters discovered a rusted metal barrel stuck in the mud. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man. Police investigators believe it was a mob hit from the 1970s or 80s, a victim dumped in the vast, deep lake, never meant to be seen again. Then another set of remains was found, and another, and another. The shrinking reservoir had become a grim, unplanned archaeological dig. Each discovery was a macabre testament to just how far the water had fallen, exposing secrets that had been submerged for half a century under hundreds of feet of water. The lake wasn't just losing its volume, it was losing its ability to hide the past. While the politicians argued, one city had been quietly preparing for the worst-case scenario for years. Las Vegas, a city of 2.3 million people in the middle of the Mojave Desert, gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead. Its survival is tied to that single, shrinking source. The city's water managers at the Southern Nevada Water Authority, led by John Ensminger, had been watching the numbers and knew they couldn't rely on hope or politics. They needed an engineering solution, a last line of defense. The problem was that the city's two existing water intakes, built in 1971 and the early 2000s, were positioned at 1,050 feet and 1,000 feet of elevation. As the lake fell below 1,050 feet, the top intake was becoming dangerously exposed, at risk of sucking in air and damaging the pumps. They were built for a 20th century lake, and the 21st century was draining it dry. So they undertook one of the most audacious and expensive municipal water projects in American history. They decided to drill a new intake, not just a little lower. They would drill it at the very bottom of the lake. They called it the third straw. The plan was to drill a 3-mile-long, 20-foot diameter tunnel through the solid rock beneath Lake Mead itself, connecting to a new intake structure positioned at an elevation of 860 feet. That number is critical. It's below dead pool. It's so deep that it can pull water even after the lake has fallen too low for the Hoover Dam to operate. It was a plan to ensure Las Vegas could keep drinking, even if the lights went out. The project cost $1.5 billion. It took 7 years. A massive tunnel boring machine chewed its way through the earth, hundreds of feet below the bottom of a lake, holding trillions of gallons of water. It was a high-stakes, high-risk endeavor. The engineering was a modern marvel. Completed in 2015, the third straw was a lifeline, a desperate, Brilliantly engineered bet on survival. It wasn't a strategy for growth, it was a strategy to prevent extinction. The city of Las Vegas had essentially built itself an emergency drain at the bottom of the bathtub. But the unavoidable, terrifying question remained. What happens when the bathtub is empty? The completion of the third straw revealed an uncomfortable dynamic. A city had spent billions to secure its own water supply, while the larger systemic problem of overuse across the basin remained unsolved. Was this the future? A world where the richest communities could afford to engineer their way out of a crisis, leaving others behind? Hey, just a quick reminder. If you're finding this story as stunning as we did, and you haven't subscribed yet, this would be the perfect moment. We pour everything we have into these deep dives, and your support makes it possible. Okay, back to it. The winter of 2022-2023 brought a shocking and temporary reprieve, and series of atmospheric rivers slammed into California and the Rocky Mountains, dumping record-breaking amounts of snow. The snowpack in the upper Colorado River Basin, which feeds the river, soared to over 160% of its average. As the snow melted in the spring, a surge of water flowed down the Colorado. Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir, rose by over 50 feet. Lake Mead rose by more than 20 feet. For the first time in years, the headlines were about rising water, not falling water. The immediate crisis was averted. The federal government, which had been threatening to impose its own cuts, backed off and accepted the state's voluntary 3 million acre-foot conservation plan. But scientists like Brad Udall at Colorado State University urged extreme caution. One good year, they warned, does not erase 20 years of drought. The system was still deeply in deficit. The lake remained more than 150 feet below full pool. The fragile recovery was built on a weather anomaly, a lucky break in a climate trend that was still pointing relentlessly toward a hotter, drier future. The 20-foot rise was a single deep breath for a system that was still slowly suffocating. The relief felt real. It was also an illusion. And now, the real battle begins. The temporary agreements, the emergency funds, the voluntary cuts, all of that expires at the end of 2026. The 7 states and the federal government are now locked in intense, high-stakes negotiations to write new rules for a new era. How do you divide a river that has fundamentally less water than it did 100 years ago? Every faction has a different answer. The lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada, have proposed a plan where future cuts are based on a combination of water rights priority and contributions to evaporation and system losses. This is a direct shot at California's Imperial Valley, which, because of its location in a hot, low-lying desert, loses a huge amount of its massive allocation to evaporation. The upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, have a different plan. They argue the primary responsibility for cuts should fall on the lower basin, which uses the majority of the water. The division is deep. It's a fight over history, economics, and physics. Who should pay the price for the original sin of the 1922 compact? The farmers with senior rights who have built their entire livelihood on a legal promise? Or the sprawling cities that grew exponentially, assuming the water would always be there? There is no easy answer. There might be no answer at all that everyone can agree on. The federal government will likely have to step in and impose a solution that will inevitably end up in court for years. The Hoover Dam itself stands as a silent witness to this unfolding human drama. Its concrete is as strong as the day it was poured. The structure is not going to collapse. That's a common misconception. The danger is not a catastrophic failure of engineering. It's a slow, quiet, operational failure. A system's collapse driven by a lack of the one resource it cannot function without: water. Paleoclimate research, using data from tree rings, reveals a disturbing history. The Colorado River Basin has experienced droughts in the past that have lasted for 30, 40, even 50 years, far longer and more severe than the mega drought of the last 2 decades. What if the drought that brought Lake Mead to the edge of disaster wasn't an anomaly? What if it was just a preview of the new normal? What if it was just the beginning? The third straw was built to reach water no drought in recorded history could touch. But our recorded history is just a tiny sliver of the region's climate story. We may be entering a chapter for which no amount of engineering is prepared. I know, it's the 3rd time. but a huge number of people watch right to the end and still forget. It really matters. Hitting that subscribe button genuinely keeps this channel alive. It takes 1 second. Thank you. The crisis of the Colorado River is a warning. It's a stress test for our future, not just in the American West, but globally. It's a story about what happens when population growth, a changing climate, and a century of flawed assumptions collide. The Hoover Dam was a monument to humanity's ability to control its environment. But the coming century will be defined not by our ability to control nature, but by our ability to adapt to a nature that is fundamentally changing beneath our feet. The dam was built to tame a river, and for a while it did. But what happens when the river itself begins to vanish? The engineering marvels of the 20th century stand ready. The turbines are waiting. The transmission lines stretch for hundreds of miles, ready to carry the power. But they are all connected to a battery that is draining faster than it can be recharged. The concrete may last for It is a monument to an age of impossible ambition, a wall of concrete holding back a river and powering the American Southwest. But the Hoover Dam is failing. Not structurally. Its power is fading. Today, its turbines generate nearly 30% less electricity than they were designed for. A direct consequence of the water behind it disappearing. This is not a forecast. This is a diagnosis. The shortages have already begun. The life or death of this entire system comes down to 3 numbers, 3 elevations above sea level. The first is 1,229 feet, full pool, a state Lake Mead has not seen in over 2 decades. The second is 950 feet, minimum power pool, the elevation at which the dam's turbines fall silent. The lights go out. The third number is the one that keeps water managers awake at night, 895 feet, dead pool, the point of no return, where water can no longer flow downstream to California, to Arizona, to Mexico. What does a world look like after the Colorado runs dry? Tell us what you think in the comments. Let's begin. Right now, the lake sits at a precarious 1,066 feet, a temporary reprieve after bottoming out at a record low of 1,040. That is a dangerously thin buffer against catastrophe. An enormous number of you who watch these videos never subscribe. If this kind of deep analysis is crucial to you, take 1 second and hit the button now. The story of this river is reaching its final act, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The crisis today was born a century ago, from a single, catastrophic mistake, an error of optimism written into law. November 24, 1922. In a palace in Santa Fe, New Mexico, 7 men representing 7 states gathered to divide one of the most powerful forces in North America. They were there to tame the Colorado River. They signed a document called the Colorado River Compact, allocating 15 million acre-feet of water a year between the upper and lower basins. A neat, clean division of a resource that seemed infinite. There was just one problem. They did their math during an abnormally wet period in the river's history. The river's true average flow wasn't 15 million acre-feet. It was closer to 13.5 million. From the moment the ink was dry, the compact promised more water than the river could actually deliver. It created what engineers call a structural deficit, a paper water reality that did not exist in the physical world. For 100 years, that deficit has been accumulating, like a debt coming due, and the dam was the mechanism for spending that debt. Authorized in 1928, construction was an act of raw force. Over 21,000 men descended on the Black Canyon, a desolate, unforgiving scorch of rock on the Nevada-Arizona border. They worked in 130-degree heat, dangling from canyon walls on ropes, breathing carbon monoxide in diversion tunnels. An official count lists 96 deaths during construction, but the true number is likely far higher. They poured 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York City. The project was so massive, the concrete had to be poured in interlocking blocks and cooled with refrigerated water pipes to prevent it from cracking under its own heat. It was a war against nature, and for a time, humanity was winning. On September 30th, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood at the crest of the completed dam and dedicated it to the nation. He called it a 20th century marvel. It was a symbol of what a nation could do when it harnessed its will against the wilderness. Behind the dam, the Colorado River began to swell. It filled the canyons, climbing the rock walls foot by foot, day by day. The rising waters crept over the valley floor, where the town of St. Thomas, Nevada once stood. Residents had been forced to leave, some setting fire to their own homes before the lake consumed them. By 1938, the last buildings disappeared beneath the surface. The river was gone. In its place was Lake Mead, a vast, placid turquoise sea in the middle of the desert, the single largest reservoir in the United States. Its weight, over 40 billion tons of water, was so immense it caused the Earth's crust to sag and triggered hundreds of small earthquakes. The dam had not just altered a river, it had bent the planet itself. And it was all built on that original sin, that 1922 math error. An entire civilization in the desert was about to be built on a promise of water that was never really there. For decades, it didn't seem to matter. The reservoir was so vast, the river so mighty, that the over-allocation felt like a rounding error. It was not. It was a time bomb. A plan built on a century-old math error. So who should pay the price for that mistake now? The sprawling cities, or the farms that feed the nation? Let us know what you think in the comments. The bomb began to detonate in the year 2000. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping sickness. A mega drought, the worst in over 1,200 years of paleoclimate records, settled over the American West. A dry spell made hotter, longer, and more severe by a changing climate. And Lake Mead began to fall. The evidence is etched into the canyon walls. A startling white scar of mineral deposits, calcium carbonate left behind on the rock. It's known as the bathtub ring, and it shows, with brutal clarity, just how much water has vanished. A drop of over 170 feet from the high water mark. It is the ghost of a lake that used to be. As the water receded, the lake began to give up its secrets, things long thought lost to the deep. In 2022, a World War II-era Higgins-Craft landing boat, the same kind that stormed the beaches of Normandy, materialized from the mud. It had sunk decades ago while surveying the river. Sunken pleasure boats from the 50s and 60s appeared, their hulls beached on dry land, hundreds of yards from the new shoreline. Then came the human remains. First, a barrel discovered stuck in the mud near a popular marina. Inside, a body. Investigators determined it was a man shot in the head, likely a victim of a mob hit from the late 1970s or early 80s, dumped in the lake when it was deep and remote. More remains followed. Skeletons found in different parts of the receding lake bed, each discovery a grim punctuation mark in the story of the water's retreat. The lake wasn't just shrinking, it was a crime scene slowly revealing itself. By the mid-2000s, the people in charge knew they were in a race. The quiet alarm inside the Bureau of Reclamation and state water agencies was growing louder. In 2007, they signed the Interim Guidelines, the first document to officially acknowledge the unthinkable, a future of shortages. It established trigger points, lake elevations that would force states to take less water. In 2019, under Commissioner Brenda Berman, they went further, signing the Drought Contingency Plans, a more aggressive set of voluntary cuts designed to protect the lake from crashing. It was a cautious, forward-thinking decision, and it still was not enough. The plans were built on models. The reality was moving faster than the models could predict. The lake kept dropping, and with it, the dam's very reason for being began to falter. The Hoover Dam is not just a water gate. It is a massive power plant. Its 17 enormous turbines were designed to be spun by the immense pressure of a full lake pressing down on them. At its peak capacity of over 2,000 megawatts, it could power 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But as the lake level drops, so does the pressure. It's the difference between water flowing from a fire hose and water trickling from a garden hose. The lower the pressure, the less force there is to turn the turbine blades, the less electricity it generates. With Lake Mead hovering at less than a third of its capacity, the dam's output has plummeted by nearly a third, a loss of over 500 megawatts of clean, peak demand power. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a direct threat to grid stability during the hottest days of summer, when air conditioners across the Southwest are running at full blast. The dam that powered the rise of cities like Los Angeles and Las Vegas can no longer be fully counted on. It is a giant weakened by thirst. If you think this is a story that needs to be understood, do us a favor and hit the like button. And if you have family anywhere in the American Southwest, share this video. They are living through this, and they need to know what's at stake. This crisis brought a new generation of players to the table, staring at the same impossible math. Camille Kalamlim-Touton, the current commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, became the public face of the federal government's response. In June 2022, she delivered a stunning ultimatum to the 7 basin states. Figure out how to cut 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water use in the next year, or the federal government would do it for them. She was blunt. The system, she testified, is at a tipping point. In Las Vegas, John Ensminger, head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, saw the train wreck coming. What has been a slow-motion train wreck for 20 years, he said, just accelerated on a geometric curve. His predecessor, a woman named Pat Mulroy, known as the Water Czar, had anticipated this exact crisis decades earlier. She pushed for a project that seemed insane at the time, a third intake straw for Las Vegas, an $817 million tunnel drilled deep under the lakebed to an elevation of 860 feet. That's below the dam's dead pool level of 895 feet. It was an insurance policy against total system failure, a way for Las Vegas to keep drinking even after the Hoover Dam itself had run dry. It was the ultimate act of desperate self-preservation. But the real fight was between the states. Arizona, with its junior water rights, was first on the chopping block. Its Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal that keeps Phoenix and Tucson alive, was facing devastating cuts. Then there was California, represented by J.B. Hamby, chairman of the state's Colorado River Board. California holds the largest and most senior water rights on the entire river. They had the law on their side, and they were not eager to give up water they believed was legally theirs. In August 2021, the federal government pulled the trigger for the first time. A Tier 1 shortage was declared. 1 year later, in August 2022, facing a relentlessly falling lake, they escalated it to an unprecedented Tier 2B shortage for 2023. The cuts were brutal. Arizona had to give up 592,000 acre-feet, a devastating 21% of its entire annual supply. Nevada lost 25,000 acre-feet. Mexico lost 104,000. To put that in perspective, 1 acre-foot is enough water for 2 typical households for a year. Arizona was losing enough water to supply over 1 million families. The paper water of 1922 was finally meeting the hard reality of 2022. The shortages were no longer hypothetical. They were here. Then, just as the models all pointed toward an unstoppable crash toward Deadpool, something happened that no one predicted. The sky opened up. The winter of 2022-2023 was not just wet, it was biblical. A relentless parade of atmospheric rivers slammed into the west. The Rocky Mountains, the source of 90% of the Colorado River's water, were buried under a historic snowpack. In some parts of the upper basin, snow levels reached over 200% of the average. I know we mentioned it before, but if you've made it this far, you are clearly one of the few who understands the gravity of this issue. We have more stories like this that need to be told, stories about the hidden systems that keep our world running. So seriously, if you haven't, hit subscribe. It is the single most important way you can support this channel and ensure this work continues. As spring arrived, that massive snowpack began to melt. A torrent of life-giving water surged down the tributaries, into the Green River, into the Colorado, and began to fill the nation's 2 largest, thirstiest reservoirs. Lake Powell, upstream from the Hoover Dam, rose by more than 50 feet. Lake Mead itself rebounded by a staggering 20 feet in a matter of months. The bathtub ring shrank. Marinas that had been stranded on dry land were suddenly back on the water. The sense of immediate crisis seemed to evaporate. Headlines celebrated the miracle winter. But scientists like Brad Udall at Colorado State University urged extreme caution. 1 good year, they warned, does not erase 20 years of drought and a century of overuse. He called the record winter a gift, but warned everyone not to squander it. The underlying structural deficit, the mathematical error of the 1922 compact, had not been fixed. The reservoirs, despite the dramatic rise, were still less than 40% full combined. The recovery was real, but it was temporary. It was a false dawn. The reprieve had bought time, but it also bred a dangerous complacency, a feeling that the worst was over. It wasn't. Because the crisis on the Colorado River has a villain that most people never see. It isn't the glimmering fountains of Las Vegas casinos. It's not the swimming pools in Phoenix. While visually arresting, those things are a rounding error in the grand scheme. The entire state of Nevada is allocated just 1.7% of the river's water. The real user, the entity that consumes 80% of all the water in the Colorado River Basin, is agriculture. Vast, sprawling farms in the deserts of Arizona and, most significantly, California's Imperial Valley. This one valley, a sun-baked region that would otherwise be barren desert, is the single largest user of Colorado River water. Thanks to its senior water rights, some of the oldest in the system, it grows a huge portion of America's winter vegetables. The lettuce in your salad in January, the broccoli, the carrots. Much of it comes from fields irrigated with water from a river that is dying. This is the central, agonizing conflict. To save the cities, you have to take water from the farms that feed the country. To keep the farms running, you drain the reservoirs that 40 million people depend on. There is no easy answer. It is a zero-sum game, played with the most essential resource on Earth. This is the impossible reality that now defines the river. The system is living on borrowed time, bought by a single wet winter and a last-minute political deal. In May 2023, facing the threat of unilateral federal cuts from Camille Touton, the three lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, did something remarkable. They announced a consensus plan. They agreed to voluntarily conserve an additional 3 million acre-feet of water through the end of 2026. This was a monumental agreement, but it came at a price. The federal government, using funds from the Inflation Reduction Act, is paying over $1 billion to incentivize this conservation, paying farmers and irrigation districts not to use water they are legally entitled to. They are using taxpayer money to pay people not to use water that doesn't exist. It is a breathtakingly expensive band-aid. It averted the immediate, catastrophic crash. It bought a few more years of stability, but it solved nothing in the long term. And the long term is staring us in the face. The clock is ticking toward a hard deadline, the end of 2025. That is when the current operating guidelines for the river, including the 2007 rules and the 2019 DCP, all expire. All 7 basin states, plus Mexico, are now locked in the most intense, high-stakes negotiations in a century. They have to write an entirely new rulebook for a permanently smaller river. They have to renegotiate the 1922 Compact for the realities of the 21st century. If they fail to reach an agreement, the federal government will almost certainly be forced to step in and impose its own solution. The chaos that would unleash is difficult to overstate. It would pit state against state, city against farm, in a legal and political war over the last remaining drops. Look, I know this might be the third time I'm saying this, but the analytics don't lie. The vast majority of people watching right now, people who have watched this whole critical story unfold, are not subscribed. If you believe this work has value, if you learned something essential today, please take the 1 second it requires to fix that. Click the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and for us, it is everything. The Hoover Dam still stands, a silent colossus of concrete and steel, a testament to a time when we believed nature was a thing to be conquered, managed, and controlled. But its foundations are being eroded not by force, but by absence. The fading hum of its turbines is a warning. The stark white line on the canyon walls is a judgment. Paleoclimate records, from tree rings and sediment cores, show that the river has endured megadroughts in the past, that were far longer and more severe than what we've just experienced. The last 20 years might not have been an anomaly. They may have been a preview of the new normal. The question is no longer whether the dam will physically stand. It will. The question is whether it will matter. An engineering marvel is useless without the water it was built to control. A power plant cannot generate electricity from a dry canyon. Below the dam, 40 million people, vast agricultural empires, and some of the world's largest economies hold their breath, dependent on a system that was flawed from its first day and is now breaking under the strain of a future it was never designed to handle. The shortages are here, the cuts are happening, and the doomsday number, 895 feet, dead pool, is no longer a theoretical abstraction. It is a destination the river is still drifting towards. With every cloudless sky, every hot summer day,
a countdown has begun at Hoover Dam, not to a date, but to a number: 1,035 feet. As of this morning, the water level of Lake Mead is hovering just above 1,042 feet, less than 8 feet away from a catastrophic failure point. Not dead pool, something faster, something more violent. It's called the hydropower cliff, a point where the physics of water pressure turn against the dam itself, where the water entering the turbines is so shallow, so lacking in force, that it begins to boil from the pressure drop alone. The phenomenon is called cavitation. Billions of tiny water vapor bubbles form and then implode against the turbine blades with the force of microscopic jackhammers. These implosions physically rip apart the hardened steel, chewing through the machinery that powers cities. At 1,035 feet, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 massive turbines cannot operate without destroying themselves. Power generation will drop by 70%. Instantly, the lights for millions of people across the American Southwest will begin to flicker. This is not a distant threat. It is the measured reality of the next few weeks. Tom Bushatsky, the director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, put it bluntly: "We're going to go to 1,035. There's no question that's going to happen. The first domino is already falling. And it lands long before the lake runs dry. The crisis is now so immediate that the federal government is playing an impossible shell game. It is called the Powell Fails First Strategy." Upstream from Lake Mead sits Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir, held back by Glen Canyon Dam. For years, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the agency that manages the river, has been deliberately draining Powell to prop up Mead, bleeding one giant to keep another one alive. They choke off the water released from Glen Canyon Dam, sacrificing its own hydropower capacity, to send just enough downstream to keep Hoover's turbines from self-destructing. It is an act of managed decline, a desperate balancing act on a razor's edge, moving water between two dying lakes. This strategy comes at a staggering cost. Reducing releases from Lake Powell to its bare minimum would slash Hoover Dam's own power output by another 40%. A preemptive power cut to stave off a total power collapse. It is the hydraulic equivalent of rationing food during a famine. It keeps the system from outright starvation, but everyone gets weaker. The bathtub ring on Lake Powell grows deeper. Its own marinas sit stranded on dry land, all in service of keeping Lake Mead just inches above the cavitation cliff. This is the reality of the Colorado River in 2026. Not a system of abundance, but a system of triage, where survival is measured in single-digit feet and every decision is about which crisis to postpone. The strategy is not a solution. It is an admission of defeat. A quiet acknowledgement that the water promised a century ago is gone, and now the only choice left is how to ration the decline. But even this desperate measure has a hard deadline. All of it, the frantic water transfers, the state-by-state conservation agreements, the international treaties, it all expires on one specific date. December 31st, 2026. In less than 6 months, the entire legal framework governing the Colorado River dissolves. The 2007 interim guidelines that set the rules for water cuts. The 2019 drought contingency plan that made those cuts more severe. Even Minute 323, the treaty that dictates water sharing with Mexico. They all end. At midnight, the rulebook for how 40 million people share a shrinking river simply disappears. Without a new agreement, the system reverts to a chaotic free for all governed by century-old laws that have no connection to the reality of a hotter, drier West. What happens on January 1st, 2027 is a question no one can answer. The federal government, led by Acting Reclamation Commissioner Scott Cameron, is trying to force a deal, pushing for a new 10-year flexible framework. The public comment period for this new plan, known as the Post-2026 Draft Environmental Impact Statement, closed on March 2nd, 2026. The 7 basin states are fiercely, fundamentally divided. This is not a polite negotiation. It is a water war fought in conference rooms by men who hold the fate of cities in their hands. In one corner is California, the state with the largest and oldest water rights on the entire river. Its interests are represented by J.B. Hamby, the chairman of the Colorado River Board of California. At just 30 years old, Hamby is the youngest major power player in the basin's history, and he represents the agricultural behemoth of the Imperial Irrigation District, which holds the single largest water allocation. His job is to protect California's legal entitlement, a share of water that was guaranteed on paper long before anyone understood the word aridification. In the other corner is Nevada, the state with the smallest allocation but the most to lose. Its lead negotiator is John Ensminger, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. He is pragmatic, sharp, and has spent 2 decades preparing his city, Las Vegas, for a doomsday scenario. He argues relentlessly that survival demands shared sacrifice, that California's historic rights cannot be a shield against the reality of a shrinking river. His position is simple: we all cut back, or the whole system dies. In the middle sits Scott Cameron, the man trying to broker a peace that seems impossible. He inherited this crisis from his predecessor, Camille Totten, who famously issued an ultimatum in 2022 demanding the states find a way to cut 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water use or have the federal government do it for them. The moment for ultimatums has passed. Now is the moment for a deal, and the clock is running out. The fight is over numbers that sound abstract but represent the literal survival of the West. Acre-feet, elevation levels, flow rates. But the most terrifying number, the one that haunts every conversation, is 895 feet. Dead pool. This is the term that makes headlines. The number that conjures images of a dry, cracked lake bed and a silent concrete behemoth. But the popular understanding of dead pool is wrong. At 895 feet, Lake Mead is not empty. Far from it. There are still millions of acre-feet of water, a vast, deep lake still held behind the dam. Dead pool simply means the water level has dropped below the dam's lowest intake pipe. Gravity can no longer pull water through the outlet works. The dam can no longer pass a single drop downstream to California, to Arizona, to Mexico. The river, for all practical purposes, stops here. For the 30 million people who live downstream, this is the apocalypse. But for the 2.3 million people living in Las Vegas, it is merely an engineering problem, and they already solved it. This is the secret that changes everything. Las Vegas is the only city on the river that can survive dead pool. They prepared for it. They spent $1.5 billion to build an insurance policy deep beneath the lake itself. It starts with a project called Intake No. 3, what locals call the third straw. Completed in 2015, it is a 3-mile-long tunnel drilled through solid volcanic rock, positioned at an elevation of 875 feet, 20 feet below dead pool. It was an audacious project, the deepest water intake in the nation, designed for a crisis that other states refused to believe was possible. But the third straw was only half the solution. A deep pipe is useless if you cannot get the water up to the surface. So, on a rocky outcrop in the middle of the lake called Saddle Island, the Southern Nevada Water Authority built something even more extraordinary. The Low Lake Level Pumping Station, or L3PS. It came online in April 2020. It is a massive cavern hollowed out of the island, housing 34 submersible pumps. Each one is a 30-ton behemoth capable of pulling water up from the deepest parts of the lake and pushing it toward the city's treatment plants. When the lake drops below the 895-foot dead pool mark and Hoover Dam's gates can no longer release water, these pumps keep working. They can draw water from an elevation so low that the rest of the lower basin goes dry. John Ensminger is not exaggerating when he says, "I think Las Vegas is and will remain the most water-secure city in the desert Southwest." While Phoenix and Los Angeles depend on gravity to deliver their share of the Colorado, Las Vegas has a mechanical heart. It can pump its own lifeblood directly from a dying lake. It is a stunning feat of engineering foresight. It also creates a terrifying geopolitical reality. The city most famous for its excess and consumption in the middle of a desert is the one city guaranteed to have water when everyone else runs out. The system was designed to ensure Vegas survives. It was not designed to save anyone else. So what actually happens when the lake drops to 895 feet? The day the water level officially passes that threshold, an irreversible chain reaction begins. For Las Vegas, nothing changes. The pumps at L3PS whir to life, pulling water from the depths. The fountains on the strip continue to run on recycled water. Taps in 2.3 million homes still flow. But for everyone downstream, the world ends. The outlet gates at Hoover Dam, massive structures that have passed water to farms and cities for nearly a century, are now just holes in a wall sitting above the waterline. No water flows into the Colorado River channel below the dam. Nothing. The riverbed that runs through Arizona and California, which is almost entirely dependent on releases from Hoover, begins to dry up. The first to feel it will be the downstream communities. Bullhead City, Arizona, Laughlin, Nevada, Needles, California, these towns draw their water directly from the river channel below the dam. Within days, their intake pumps will be sucking air. Then the crisis moves to the massive aqueduct systems. The Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile-long canal that carries water to Phoenix and Tucson, will receive nothing from Lake Mead. Its intake is at Lake Havasu, downstream, but Havasu is fed by Hoover. With no flow from Hoover, Havasu begins to drain. Arizona loses its single largest source of renewable water. For California, the impact is even more biblical. The Colorado River Aqueduct, a marvel of engineering that carries water 242 miles across the desert to serve 19 million people in Southern California, goes dry. The Metropolitan Water District, or MWD, loses a massive portion of its supply. But the most devastating blow lands in the Imperial Valley. Here, the Imperial Irrigation District, JB. Hamby's district uses more water than Arizona and Nevada combined to irrigate nearly 500,000 acres of farmland. This is the winter breadbasket for the entire United States, growing over 80% of America's winter vegetables. It all depends on water flowing from Hoover Dam into the All-American Canal. When that flow stops, the valley's name becomes a cruel irony. The fields turn to dust. The multi-billion-dollar agricultural economy collapses. This is not hyperbole. It is simple cause and effect. And finally, the water never reaches Mexico. The 1.5 million acre-feet legally promised to Mexico by international treaty cannot be delivered. A sovereign nation is cut off, triggering an international crisis on top of the domestic one. Dead pool at Hoover Dam does not mean the end of Las Vegas. It means the end of the lower Colorado River as we know it. It turns a shared resource into a private lake for one city, while stranding 30 million people and the nation's food supply. Everyone knows this is coming. The system is flashing red alerts. The proof is in the desperate, eye-wateringly expensive deals being cut right now, today, just to keep the lake from falling another foot. On July 14th, 2026, a stunning announcement was made. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the massive water wholesaler for Los Angeles and its surrounding cities, agreed to a deal. They would leave 200,000 acre-feet of their legally allocated water inside Lake Mead this year instead of taking it. In exchange, the federal government, through the Bureau of Reclamation, will pay them up to $65 million. The money comes from the Inflation Reduction Act, a fund meant for climate resilience. They are literally buying water from California and leaving it in the lake. The cost is $325 for every acre-foot. And what does this $65 million emergency purchase accomplish? It will raise Lake Mead's elevation by approximately 3 feet. 3 feet. It is a multi-million-dollar Band-Aid for a hemorrhaging artery. An act of pure desperation designed to do one thing: push the 1,035-foot hydropower cliff just a few more months into the future. It buys a little more time for the turbines, a little more time for the negotiators locked in their rooms. It solves nothing. It is a tax on survival, paid by the federal government, to postpone a collapse that the math says is still coming. At the same time, another emergency repair is underway inside the dam itself. On May 24th, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced a $52 million investment. They are fast-tracking the replacement of 3 of Hoover Dam's oldest turbines. The new machines are a specialized design called wide-head turbines. They are engineered specifically to do what the old ones cannot: operate efficiently in low water conditions. While the old turbines face destruction from cavitation below 1,035 feet, these new ones can continue generating power safely all the way down to the 950-foot minimum power pool level. This is the new definition of resilience on the Colorado River. Not fixing the water shortage, but engineering machines that can function better during the decline. The $52 million project will not add a single drop of water to the lake. It will not solve the deficit. It simply allows the dam to keep producing electricity a little longer as the lake continues to vanish. It is a perfect metaphor for the entire crisis. Instead of refilling the glass, we are building a better straw to reach the last few drops at the bottom. And even these straws have their limits. The new turbines work down to 950 feet. The Las Vegas intake works down to 875 feet. But the lake bottom itself is not static. For 90 years, since the dam was completed on March 1st, 1936, the Colorado River has been dumping insane amounts of silt and sediment behind it. The floor of Lake Mead is rising. Some reports claim the sediment is over 100 feet deep in places. While the exact depth is a matter of debate, the phenomenon is not. The lake is losing physical storage capacity every single year. The dead pool elevation of 895 feet is a measurement from sea level. It is not a measurement from the bedrock. As the floor rises, the amount of usable water shrinks. The dam is slowly silting in from the bottom up. We are racing toward a crisis point that is itself creeping higher to meet us. It all comes back to a single foundational lie, a miscalculation made in 1922. When the 7 basin states gathered to sign the Colorado River Compact, they divided up the river's water. They allocated 7.5 million acre-feet annually to the upper basin states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. They allocated another 7.5 million to the lower basin of Arizona, California, and Nevada. Later, 1.5 million was promised to Mexico, a total of 16.5 million acre-feet promised on paper. The problem is, that number was based on flow measurements from one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. The men who signed the compact were looking at a river in a state of unnatural abundance and believed it was normal. They wrote a rulebook for a river that does not exist. In an average year, the Colorado produces closer to 13 or 14 million acre-feet. Some years, much less. We have been spending from a bank account that was never as full as the opening balance suggested. For a century, the deficit has been accumulating, masked by the massive storage capacity of Mead and Powell. Now, the reservoirs are nearly empty, the buffer is gone, and the math no longer works. The crisis has revealed an uncomfortable truth. Las Vegas, the city that should not exist, built by defying the desert, has become the ultimate survivor. Through a combination of audacious engineering and aggressive conservation, it has insulated itself from the worst of the collapse. Nevada has outlawed ornamental grass on street medians. Homeowner associations are legally prohibited from fining residents who let their lawns go brown. The city recycles nearly 99% of its indoor water, treating it and returning it to Lake Mead for credits. They have cut per capita water use by over 40% while their population boomed. They built the tunnel, they built the pumping station, they prepared for the end. But in saving itself, Las Vegas has created an island, a fortified water fortress in the middle of a collapsing ecosystem. And everyone else is outside the walls. Phoenix, Los Angeles, the farms of the Imperial Valley. They are all still bound by the old system, a system of gravity, of canals, of a belief that the water will always flow from the mountains. They are facing a future where their survival depends on the outcome of a negotiation that is deadlocked, where their water supply is being propped up week to week by multi-million-dollar emergency payments, where the physical mechanics of Hoover Dam are the final arbiter of their fate. The post-2026 negotiations are not just about water. They are about confronting the original sin of 1922. They are about deciding who gets to survive in a future with less. Does California's century-old legal right to the largest share trump the needs of Arizona's growing cities? Does agriculture, which uses 80% of the river's water, have to fundamentally shrink to keep taps on in urban centers? These are the questions with no easy answers. the questions the tunnel under Lake Mead was never designed to solve. The third straw bought time. The emergency water purchases are buying time. The new turbines are buying time. But time for what? Time for policy to catch up to physics. Time for a miraculous string of record-breaking snowfalls to refill a system that took 2 decades to drain. Time for 7 states, 40 million people, and 2 countries to agree on how to share a resource that is already gone. The engineering has done all it can. The concrete is poured. The pumps are installed. The tunnel sits in permanent darkness, ready. But survival is no longer an engineering problem. The clock is ticking toward midnight on December 31st. And when it strikes, the future of the American West will be. Hoover Dam just made a desperate $52 million bet, and if it loses, the power grid for the Southwest goes dark. Right now, one of the greatest engineering marvels of the 20th century is facing a crisis its builders never saw coming. A threat born, not from too much water, but from too little. The reservoir that feeds it, Lake Mead, is falling toward a single unforgiving number, 0.35 feet. Below that line, 12 of the dam's 17 turbines will have to be shut down completely. They won't just throttle them back or put them on standby. They have to take them offline entirely to stop them from literally tearing themselves apart. The power loss would be immediate and catastrophic. Hoover Dam's generating capacity would plummet from over 1,300 megawatts down to just 382. That is a massive 70% reduction in power for 1.3 million people across 3 states. So, on May 21, 2026, federal authorities initiated a last-ditch engineering intervention. The plan is to replace the dam's 90-year-old technology with new turbines designed for a world of severe drought, something its original architects never planned for. It should have been a story of foresight. But here's what they didn't tell you. The lake is still falling. The new federal projections are worse than anyone thought possible, and the new turbines will not be ready in time. The math is brutal and simple. The dam is now caught in an 18-month gap between when the old system fails and the new one comes online. The question is no longer whether the crisis is coming. The question is, what happens inside those 18 months? Did they just save Hoover Dam, or did they just fund a $52 million front row seat to a disaster that was already locked in? To understand the crisis, you have to understand the weapon that is threatening to destroy Hoover Dam. And it's not what you think. The enemy isn't the awesome crushing force of a full reservoir. It's actually the opposite. The enemy is a ghost that appears when the water is gone. It's a physical phenomenon called cavitation, and it can eat right through solid steel. A hydropower turbine is incredibly precise. Water flows through a channel, building pressure until it hits the curved blades of a runner, spinning it at hundreds of revolutions per minute. That spin turns a generator, and that generator makes electricity. The entire system is designed to operate under immense, constant pressure. The weight of trillions of gallons of water from Lake Mead provides that pressure. But as the lake level drops, the pressure weakens. Below an elevation of 1,035 feet, the water flowing toward 12 of the dam's older turbines no longer has enough force to remain stable as it accelerates around the blades. And that's when cavitation starts. Microscopic vapor bubbles begin to form in the low-pressure zones of the water. They are basically tiny pockets of nothing. They are harmless for a fraction of a second, but then as they whip around the turbine blades into a zone of higher pressure, they violently collapse. They implode. Each bubble collapse creates a shockwave, a miniature explosion that slams against the turbine's steel surface with terrifying force. It's like being attacked by millions of microscopic hammers striking the exact same spot over and over again. At first, the damage is invisible. You get micro-pitting on the surface of the steel. But the attack is relentless. The tiny pits grow into craters, and those craters link up to form deep gouges. Within months, a perfectly balanced multi-ton steel turbine blade that was designed to last a century can be chewed apart until it is warped and completely useless. The vibrations can shake the entire generator housing, threatening the stability of the dam itself. It is a quiet, insidious, and brutally efficient form of destruction. Running the old turbines below 1,035 feet isn't a risk, it's a guarantee of failure. This is the reality that has kept engineers at the Bureau of Reclamation awake at night for the last decade. They watched the bathtub ring grow on Lake Mead's canyon walls, a stark white scar, marking the relentless decline. They knew the 1,035-foot line was not just a number on a chart. It was a physical threshold, a point of no return for the machinery they were sworn to protect. A choice was coming: shut down the power for millions of people, or let the dam's own turbines commit a slow, grinding suicide. And the lake was already starting to disappear far faster than the models had predicted. The Hoover Dam was never just a structure. It was a statement. Built between 1931 and 1936, it was the largest concrete object ever created by humanity at the time, a monument to an era when America believed it could bend nature to its will. The men who designed it did so during one of the wettest periods in the history of the American West. They saw the Colorado River as a wild, untamed beast, and their job was to break it, to store its floodwaters and put them to work. The idea that the river itself could one day shrink, or that the problem might be a lack of water, seemed completely absurd back then. They designed the dam for abundance. The 17 turbines installed in its powerhouse were high-head turbines, engineered to perform optimally under the immense pressure of a full or nearly full Lake Mead. They were built to last, forged from the best steel of the day. For decades, they worked flawlessly. Lake Mead stayed high, the river delivered, and the lights stayed on across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But the dam was built on a foundational error, a miscalculation that would take 80 years to fully mature into a crisis. The 1922 Colorado River Compact, the legal document that divides the river's water among 7 states, was based on flow measurements from an abnormally wet period. It promised more water than the river could reliably provide. For most of the 20th century, that didn't matter, because the upper basin states weren't using their full share. But as populations boomed in Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas, the demand began to catch up to the flawed promise. By the early 2000s, demand outstripped supply. The system went into a deficit, and the great reservoirs, Powell and Mead, began to drain. The machinery of the 1930s was now facing the climate of the 21st century, and it was not prepared. The very design that made the turbines so efficient at high pressure made them incredibly vulnerable to low pressure. The engineers saw the problem coming. They knew new technology existed, specifically turbines designed for low-head, low-pressure conditions. But replacing them would be a massive, expensive undertaking. It required $52 million to be exact. And that money was nowhere to be found. For over 25 years, the solution to Hoover Dam's existential crisis sat in a forgotten bank account, legally untouchable. The $52 million wasn't new taxpayer money. It was old money from ratepayers, decades ago, customers of the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, paid into a fund intended to cover the post-retirement benefits of its employees. It was a responsible plan. But then, through an administrative shift, WAPA found a different way to cover those benefits. The original fund, holding millions of dollars, was just left sitting there orphaned. The money was there, and the need was growing more desperate by the day. But a bureaucratic dead end meant the Bureau of Reclamation legally could not touch it. The funds were trapped in a kind of administrative purgatory. As Lake Mead dropped foot by agonizing foot, and as engineers modeled the catastrophic failure of the turbines, the money that could have started the fix sat on a balance sheet, held hostage by a decades-old clerical error. The frustration mounted. Nevada's governor, Joe Lombardo, aggressively pressured the Department of the Interior to find a way to release the funds. Pui Premsriroot, the chairwoman of the Colorado River Commission of Nevada, made the case in stark terms. warning that the dam's ability to generate power was at imminent risk. Still, the bureaucratic walls held. It took a literal act of Congress to break the lock. Nevada's Senator Catherine Cortez Masto and Representative Susie Lee recognized the absurdity of the situation. They drafted and championed a piece of legislation with a name as direct as the crisis itself, the Help Hoover Dam Act. The bill was a surgical strike. It didn't authorize new spending. It simply unlocked the door to the room where the $52 million was already sitting. As Senator Cortez Masto put it, millions of federal dollars had been sitting unused for decades while the Hoover Dam needed upgrades. Her new law finally solved that bureaucratic dead end. In February 2026, the bill was signed into law. The money was finally free. On May 21st, the Bureau of Reclamation officially announced the investment. Andrea Travnicek, the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, declared that the funds would protect reliable hydropower generation. It was a victory lap for common sense, a celebration of cutting through red tape. But the lost time could not be reclaimed. Years had been wasted, and in the desert, the clock never stops running. The crisis had not waited for Congress to act. It had accelerated. The plan was a feat of modern engineering retrofitted onto a historical titan. The goal was to replace up to 3 of the dam's most vulnerable older turbines with a newer, more resilient technology called wide-head turbines. The name itself describes the design philosophy. These turbines have blades that are shaped differently, broader and contoured to work efficiently in water with less pressure. They can safely generate power with lake levels all the way down to 950 feet above sea level. That is the dam's minimum power pool, the absolute lowest the water can be before the intakes go completely dry. This was not an upgrade. It was a calculated retreat. The new turbines don't generate more power than the old ones at peak capacity. They are an act of triage, a survival mechanism designed to extract some energy from a dying system without destroying the equipment in the process. It is the engineering equivalent of shifting from a mindset of conquest to one of endurance. The original 1930s dam was built to tame a river, but these 2026 turbines are being installed just to survive a drought. The $52 million would cover the design, manufacturing, and complex installation of these new units deep inside the dam's concrete heart. This is not like changing a tire. It involves disassembling multi-ton components in a cramped 90-year-old powerhouse, removing the massive original turbine runners, and craning in new ones with microscopic precision. The process is slow, deliberate, and completely unforgiving. The official announcement from the Bureau of Reclamation on May 21st was full of confidence. But there was one critical detail conspicuously missing from the press release: a completion date. The federal government, in its moment of announcing the solution, refused to say when the problem would actually be solved. It was Eric Witkowski, the executive director of the Colorado River Commission of Nevada, who let the real timeline slip. He stated publicly that the installation of just 2 of the 3 turbines would take until October of 2028 at the earliest. And that date changed everything, because just 1 month later, the federal government released a new study that made October 2028 feel like a lifetime away. On June 18, 2026, federal forecasters published a new 24-month projection for the Colorado River system. The numbers were devastating. Sarah Porter, a leading expert at Arizona State University's Kill Center for Water Policy, put it bluntly, saying it was very grim and that the study showed we are in a really bad place. The new forecast showed that the slow demise of Lake Mead had just sped up dramatically. The study projected that Lake Mead would plummet past the critical 1,035-foot threshold by July of 2027, which is just 1 year from now. It wouldn't just dip below the line, it would crash right through it, hitting a projected elevation of 1,015.77 feet. And it would keep falling, hitting a staggering new record low of 1,011.74 feet by May of 2028. The math was suddenly unavoidable. a death sentence for the old turbines. July 2027 is when the cavitation cliff arrives. October 2028 is when the new, resilient turbines come online. There it is, a 15 to 18-month gap. A guaranteed window of time where 12 of Hoover Dam's turbines would have to be shut down, where its power output would be crippled, and where the new technology meant to save it would still be sitting in pieces on the powerhouse floor. The $52 million Hail Mary had been thrown, but it was not going to reach the end zone in time. The grid that powers the Southwest was now facing a year and a half of running on fumes. The solution everyone had celebrated in May was revealed in June to be arriving catastrophically late. The dam's fate is not entirely its own. It is a hostage to decisions being made 290 miles upstream at another concrete behemoth, Glen Canyon Dam. Lake Powell, the reservoir behind Glen Canyon, is the Colorado River's other great storage tank, and it is also in crisis. Its own minimum power pool sits at 3,490 feet. If it drops below that, Glen Canyon Dam stops producing electricity for millions across the rural West. To prevent that from happening, the Bureau of Reclamation has been making a terrible choice. They have been holding back water in Lake Powell, significantly reducing the amount that flows downstream to Lake Mead. It's a desperate act of triage, sacrificing one reservoir to save another. Every gallon of water that stays in Powell to keep its turbines spinning is a gallon that does not arrive in Mead to keep its levels above the 1,035-foot line. America's two largest reservoirs are now locked in a zero-sum game. The survival of one actively accelerates the demise of the other. This upstream sacrifice is the primary reason the June 2026 forecast for Lake Mead was so grim. The projections aren't just about a lack of snowfall in the Rockies. They are about deliberate, man-made policy decisions. The river is being choked off upstream to keep the lights on in places like Utah and Wyoming, at the direct expense of the power grid for Arizona, Nevada, and California. This is the larger context for the $52 million turbine replacement. It's an attempt to adapt one part of a system that is failing at every level. While engineers work to make Hoover Dam's turbines more resilient to low water, policymakers upstream are guaranteeing that low water is exactly what the dam will get. The right hand is retrofitting the engine, while the left hand is cutting the fuel line. 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for their water, from farms that feed the nation to cities that power the American economy. But for the 1.3 million people who get their electricity from Hoover Dam, the crisis is more immediate. What does a 70% reduction in power actually look like? It means that from July 2027 to October 2028, the dam will only be producing 382 megawatts when it should be producing 1,102. It means the energy supply for the region becomes fragile, unpredictable, and dangerously thin. In a place like Las Vegas or Phoenix, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees, reliable air conditioning is not a luxury. It is a public health necessity. A sustained power deficit during a summer heat wave could lead to rolling blackouts, overwhelming emergency services, and putting the most vulnerable populations at risk. It would paralyze businesses and strain the basic functions of a modern city. The new wide-head turbines are a remarkable piece of engineering, but they are not a silver bullet. They are a response to a symptom, not a cure for the disease. The disease is a century of over-allocation, a refusal to accept the physical limits of a river, and a climate that is making the problem worse every single year. The dam's final line of defense against total power failure is a dead pool elevation of 895 feet. At that point, water can no longer flow downstream through the dam at all. Las Vegas would lose its primary water source, Southern California's agriculture would collapse, and the dam would become a massive, useless concrete plug in the middle of a desert, an artifact of a wetter time. The new turbines can operate down to 950 feet, buying the system an extra 55 feet of operational capacity. But the June 2026 forecast, the one that showed the lake hitting 1,011 feet by 2028, also showed it continuing to drop. The relief offered by the new technology is temporary. It pushes the cliff back, but it does not remove it. The system is still draining. The $52 million has been spent, the contracts are signed, and the work has begun. But the rescue is moving at the speed of bureaucracy and manufacturing, while the crisis is moving at the speed of physics. This isn't a failure of engineering, it's a failure of time. For 25 years, the money that could have provided a buffer sat locked away. Had this project started a decade ago, the new turbines might have been spinning today, ready for the drop that is now coming. But it didn't. And so the 18-month gap is now baked into the future of the American Southwest. It is a period of extreme vulnerability that was entirely predictable and potentially avoidable. The Hoover Dam, once the ultimate symbol of American confidence and control over its environment, is now a symbol of something else entirely. It is a place of desperate adaptation, where engineers are in a frantic race against a clock they can no longer control. The Hail Mary has been thrown. The number is 1,035 feet. It is not an estimate. It is a mechanical certainty, an engineering absolute written in steel and concrete 9 decades ago. And right now, the Hoover Dam is just over 7 feet away from it. The warning was 9 feet, a line in the sand drawn weeks ago. But the water is dropping faster than the warnings can be issued, roughly 1 foot every 5 to 7 days. A relentless, unforgiving descent into a crisis point the American power grid was never designed to withstand. Because at 1,035 feet, the laws of physics take over. A phenomenon called cavitation begins. It is not a gentle process. Low water pressure allows microscopic air bubbles to form inside the dam's massive pipes. As those bubbles are pulled through the turbines, the pressure changes and they collapse with violent, explosive force. They become microscopic demolition charges, hammering the turbine blades, tearing apart solid steel from the inside out. To save the dam from destroying itself, 12 of its 17 turbines must go dark. Not slowed down. Shut down. The consequence is a 70% power cut. Immediate and catastrophic. Hoover Dam's generating capacity will drop from 1,302 megawatts down to just 382. An electrical artery that powers cities across 3 states severed in an instant. This is not a distant threat. This is not a climate model projection for 2050. This is happening now. And the federal government, the very agency that manages the dam, has made a deliberate choice that is pushing it over the edge. A decision has been made. But they are not talking about it. The question is why? What are they not telling you about the water behind that wall? To understand the silence, you first have to understand the choice. A choice made in the sterile meeting rooms of the Department of the Interior, hundreds of miles from the canyon cliffs. A choice that sacrificed one of America's great reservoirs to save another. The story begins a century ago. 1922, the Colorado River Compact. 7 men representing 7 states gathered to divide the water of a river they believed was infinite. They based their calculations on flow measurements from an unusually wet period, a statistical anomaly. It was a fatal error, a mathematical sin that doomed the entire system from its first signature. They allocated 15 million acre-feet of water per year from a river that we now know carries closer to 12 million in an average year. The West was built on a lie, not a malicious lie, an optimistic one. A lie that has been accumulating, like a debt, for 100 years. That debt is stored in 2 great reservoirs, 2 massive artificial lakes that act as the system's battery and engine. Upstream, there is Lake Powell, held back by the elegant curve of Glen Canyon Dam. Downstream, there is Lake Mead, the behemoth, penned in by the defiant wall of Hoover Dam. For decades, the system worked. Water released from Powell would flow down the Grand Canyon to fill Mead, which would then deliver water and power to California, Nevada, and Arizona. A delicate, man-made equilibrium. Then the equilibrium broke. 2 decades of drought, what scientists now call aridification, began to drain both lakes simultaneously. By late 2025, Lake Powell was in critical condition. Its water level was plummeting toward its own power cliff. Glen Canyon Dam was facing its own version of the 1,035-foot crisis. If it failed, the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, would lose a vital power source. The entire upper half of the system would begin to collapse. So the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, under the direction of the new Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, was faced with an impossible decision. A trolley problem written across a desert landscape. Let Lake Powell continue to fall and risk the failure of Glen Canyon Dam? Or pull a lever, change the track, and divert the disaster somewhere else? They pulled the lever. In early 2026, the federal government radically reduced the amount of water released from Lake Powell. The gates at Glen Canyon Dam, which had for years sent a steady managed pulse of the Colorado River downstream, were throttled back. The flow was choked to a trickle of its former self. It was a desperate move to keep the turbines at Glen Canyon spinning, to keep Lake Powell alive, and it came at a direct cost to Lake Mead. Suddenly, the great reservoir was being starved. The river that had fed it for 9 decades was cut off at the source. Lake Mead's water level, already historically low, began to fall at a terrifying new velocity. The gradual decline became a freefall. The slow motion crisis became an emergency. This was not an accident. It was a policy decision. A calculated sacrifice. Aubrey Betancourt, the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation and a third-generation California agricultural leader, was tasked with implementing this grim equation. The federal government chose to save the upstream reservoir, and in doing so, condemned the downstream one. They pushed Hoover Dam directly into the path of the disaster. Tom Bushatsky, the chief water negotiator for Arizona, saw the writing on the wall immediately. In May of 2026, he stated it with blunt resignation. "We're going to go to 1,035, he said. "There's no question that's going to happen." It was not a prediction. It was an acknowledgement of a known consequence. The federal government had pushed the button. The countdown had begun. The silence from Washington, D.C. is not confusion. It is the quiet of an agency that knows exactly what is coming, because they are the ones who caused it. They are managing the controlled demolition of Lake Mead's power capacity, hoping nobody notices until the lights have already gone out. The Hoover Dam is not just a structure. It is a declaration. An announcement made in 5 million barrels of cement and 45 million pounds of steel that the American century had arrived. It rose from the floor of Black Canyon during the Great Depression, a monument to a nation's belief in its own ability to tame nature. For 90 years, it has been the very definition of reliability. Constant, immense, and unmoving. But the dam was designed with one non-negotiable assumption, that the water would remain high enough. Its engineering is magnificent, but it is not magic. It is subject to the fundamental laws of fluid dynamics, and it is one of those laws that now threatens to tear it apart from within. To understand what is about to happen, you must go inside the dam itself. Deep inside the concrete, 4 massive intake towers rise from the canyon floor, 2 on the Nevada side, 2 on the Arizona side. They are like giant straws, 30 feet in diameter, pulling water from the lake and feeding it into a web of enormous pipes called penstocks. These penstocks, some as wide as a 2-lane road, carry the water on a steep downward plunge toward the powerhouse at the base of the dam. It is a drop of over 500 feet. The sheer weight and velocity of that falling water becomes a colossal hydraulic hammer, spinning the blades of 17 turbines. This entire system, this perfectly orchestrated dance of gravity and pressure, depends on having enough water weight pushing down from above. Lake Mead itself is part of the machine. The higher the lake, the more pressure it exerts, keeping the water in the penstock stable and dense. But when the lake level drops to 1,035 feet above sea level, that pressure falls below a critical threshold. The water becomes unstable. As it screams through the turbines at over 80 miles per hour, the pressure drop is so severe that it literally boils the water at room temperature. Tiny pockets of water vapor, air bubbles, form spontaneously in the flow. This is cavitation. The danger is not in their creation, it is in their destruction. As these bubbles travel nanoseconds later into a higher pressure zone near the backside of the turbine blade, they do not pop. They implode. They collapse in on themselves with a force so focused and so violent that it generates shockwaves and temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun for a microsecond. Imagine millions of microscopic jackhammers pounding on the surface of the turbine runner. A relentless, high-frequency assault. The sound is a deafening roar of gravel and grinding metal. The vibration shakes the entire powerhouse. Over time, these implosions physically chip away at the hardened steel, creating pits, then craters, until the blade itself is gouged out, torn, and destroyed. Running a turbine under these conditions is not just inefficient, it is an act of mechanical suicide. So the Bureau of Reclamation has a rule: a hard stop. At 1,035 feet, the 12 oldest, most vulnerable turbines must be shut down. They cannot risk the catastrophic failure. They will flip the switches, and a massive portion of the American Southwest's power supply will simply vanish. This is the power cliff. The government is not entirely idle. They know this is coming. On May 21, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced what it framed as a proactive solution: a $52 million investment to upgrade some of the aging turbines. It was presented as a forward-thinking fix, proof that the system was being modernized to meet the challenge. But here is the math they did not put in the press release. That $52 million is not a comprehensive overhaul. It is a patch job. The money, pulled from something called the Post-Retirement Benefit Fund, is only enough to replace a maximum of 3 of the 17 turbines. 3. These new turbines are called wide-head models. They are an impressive piece of engineering designed to operate more efficiently under the low-pressure conditions created by a shrinking lake. They can, in theory, continue to generate power even when the lake drops as low as 950 feet, the absolute minimum power pool. It sounds like a lifeline, but you cannot ignore the other turbines. The dam has 17 of them. 12 of the older models are the ones that face destruction from cavitation at 1,035 feet. The government's plan upgrades just 3 of them. That means when Lake Mead hits the magic number, 9 turbines, 9 massive power generating units are still doomed to go completely dark. The $52 million investment does not avert the 70% power cut. It barely mitigates it. It is a rounding error in the face of a systemic crisis. A full retrofit of all the vulnerable turbines, according to the Bureau's own internal estimates, would cost upwards of $200 million. They are spending 26 cents on the dollar, hoping for a miracle. It is not a solution. It is a calculated, public-facing gesture designed to create the appearance of action while the catastrophe unfolds on schedule. The engineers at the dam know this. The water managers in Arizona and Nevada know this. And deep inside the Department of the Interior, they know it too. They are preparing for a blackout, not preventing one. The failure of Hoover Dam does not happen in a vacuum. The silent turbines are just the beginning of a chain reaction, a shockwave that will radiate out across the economy and society of the American Southwest. It is a story told not just in megawatts, but in grocery bills, in shuttered farms, and in the anxious quiet of neighborhoods wondering if the air conditioning will turn on during the next 115-degree heat wave. Jordi Fuentes sees it coming. As the executive director of the Arizona Power Authority, his job is to secure electricity for a long list of customers, irrigation districts, tribal nations, small towns. For decades, his most reliable and affordable product has been Hoover Dam hydropower. It is cheap energy, sold at cost by the federal government. But that is about to change. We're basically knocking out most of Hoover's generating capacity, Fuentes explained in April of 2026. As the 70% power cut hits, the Western Area Power Administration, the federal agency that markets the electricity, will have to replace that lost hydropower with something else. That something else is natural gas, purchased on the volatile, open market. Hydropower is the backbone of the grid for a reason. It is baseline power, but it is also dispatchable. It can be ramped up or down in minutes to meet sudden spikes in demand. Like when millions of air conditioners all kick on during a summer afternoon. Natural gas plants can do this too, but at a staggering cost. The price of natural gas can swing wildly based on global supply, politics, and even the weather. When the cheap, stable power from Hoover disappears, utilities will have no choice but to buy expensive, unpredictable power from the grid. That cost gets passed directly to the consumer. Jordi Fuentes put it bluntly, when that happens, the resource becomes unaffordable for most of our customers. What does unaffordable look like? It looks like a farmer in central Arizona whose bill for pumping irrigation water skyrockets, forcing him to let fields go fallow. It looks like a family in a small Nevada town watching their summer utility bill double or triple, forcing impossible choices between electricity and other necessities. It is an inflation bomb, primed and ready to detonate across the regional economy, and power is only the first crisis. The second is far more elemental. Water. The 1,035-foot power cliff is a mechanical problem. But below it lies an even more terrifying threshold, 895 feet. This is dead pool. It is not a technical term for when the power goes out. It is the elevation at which the water level in Lake Mead drops below the lowest intake valves on the dam. At 895 feet, the Hoover Dam ceases to be a dam. It becomes a wall. Water stops flowing downstream. Period. The consequences of this are almost unimaginable. The vast agricultural empire of Southern California's Imperial Valley, which grows a huge portion of America's winter vegetables, would lose its primary source of irrigation water. The cities of Southern California, including parts of Los Angeles and San Diego, would face a catastrophic supply cut. And the nation of Mexico, which has a treaty right to 1.5 million acre-feet of water each year, would see its supply line completely severed. It is a scenario that triggers not just economic collapse, but international crisis. And hidden within that crisis is a strange and fragile paradox. Under an international agreement called Minute 323, Mexico has been allowed to bank some of its unused water allocation inside Lake Mead. It functions like a savings account. As of mid-2026, that account holds roughly 200,000 acre-feet of water. This is not American water. It is Mexican water, stored in an American reservoir. And it has been one of the secret, unsung buffers keeping Lake Mead artificially afloat. That water belongs to Mexico. And that agreement, like everything else, expires at the end of this year. This cascade of failure has triggered a frantic, almost surreal response from the federal government. On July 15, 2026, they announced a deal. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the massive utility that serves 19 million people, agreed to leave up to 200,000 acre-feet of its own water inside Lake Mead. They would voluntarily take less than they are entitled to. They did not do this out of charity. The federal government, using funds allocated by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, is paying them to do it. The price tag is $325 per acre foot. That is a total payout of up to $65 million. Think about what is happening here. The federal government, having made a decision that is actively draining Lake Mead to save Lake Powell, is now paying one of the biggest water users on the river to not use its water, in order to slow the very crisis the government itself accelerated. It is a frantic shell game, using taxpayer money to bribe one part of the system to compensate for a deliberate choice made somewhere else. And it is this absurdity that makes the final layer of this crisis so infuriating. While the government is cutting 9-figure checks to California water barons, ordinary citizens are being punished for trying to do the exact same thing on a smaller scale. All across the suburbs of Las Vegas and Phoenix, homeowner associations continue to send violation letters and issue fines to residents who let their grass go brown, who try to conserve water by not watering a useless patch of decorative lawn. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. A family trying to save a few thousand gallons faces fines and liens on their home, while a utility gets a $65 million prize for saving billions of gallons. But here is something those HOAs do not want you to know. They often do not have the legal power they claim. In Nevada, a state law, NRS 116.330, explicitly protects a homeowner's right to install xeriscaping, drought-tolerant landscaping. It prevents an HOA from forcing you to maintain a lush, green lawn in the middle of a desert. In Arizona, a similar law, Rs. 33, 1817, provides legal cover for residents who choose to use artificial turf or other water-saving landscapes. These laws exist. They are the shield that individual citizens can use to fight back against the absurd aesthetic demands of a handful of neighborhood committee members, while the entire region slides toward a water catastrophe. The dam is failing, and the water police are worried about brown lawns. The frantic deal-making and the desperate engineering patches are all aimed at one thing: buying time. But time is the one commodity the Colorado River system is truly running out of. Because the most important deadline is not a water level, it is a date on a calendar. December 31st, 2026, New Year's Eve, at midnight, as the year ends, the entire legal and operational framework that governs the Colorado River simply vanishes. The rules expire. The book is thrown out. 3 foundational documents all terminate on that exact same day. First, the 2007 Colorado River Interim Guidelines. This is the rulebook that has dictated shortage cuts for the past 2 decades. When it expires, there is no agreed-upon process for deciding who gets cut and by how much. Second, the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan. This was an emergency overlay, a desperate agreement hammered out by the states to create deeper, more painful cuts as the lakes plummeted. That plan also dissolves at the end of the year. Third, and perhaps most critically, is Minute 323, the treaty addendum that governs water sharing with Mexico, including the provision that allows Mexico to store its water in Lake Mead. When that treaty expires, the relationship with a sovereign nation that depends on the river becomes a massive, open question. An entire century of law, treaties, and gentlemen's agreements built to manage the West's most important river will evaporate in a single moment. It is a legal time bomb, and it is less than 6 months away. What follows is a void. Right now, behind closed doors, the 7 basin states are locked in a bitter civil war over what comes next. They are negotiating the post-2026 operations. It is a fight that pits the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, against the lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. It pits agriculture, which uses nearly 80% of the river's water, against the booming cities. The states cannot agree. Their proposals are miles apart, representing fundamentally different visions for who should bear the pain of a shrinking river. California, with the oldest and most senior water rights, has historically argued for a first-in-time, first-in-right system, meaning junior users like Arizona and Nevada would suffer the deepest cuts. Arizona argues that approach would destroy its economy and that the pain must be shared more equitably. The upper basin argues that the lower basin has been overusing its allocation for decades and the primary cuts must come from them. The negotiations have stalled, the deadline looms, and the federal government is losing its patience. This is the context for Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum's recent statements. The department cannot delay action, he declared. Meeting this deadline is essential to ensure certainty and stability for the Colorado River system beyond 2026. That is not the language of a mediator. That is the language of an enforcer. The federal government, which controls the dams and therefore controls the water, is signaling that if the states cannot produce a compromise, the Department of the Interior will impose one. It would be an unprecedented use of federal power, dictating the economic future of a region the size of France. But the alternative is chaos, a multi-state water war fought in the courts for years while the reservoirs run dry. And beneath all the legal wrangling, the politics, and the engineering lies the one variable that no one can control: the weather. The fundamental truth is that this entire crisis is being driven by the amount of snow that falls in the Rocky Mountains hundreds of miles away. One good winter, like the one in 2023, can provide a temporary reprieve, adding 20 feet of water to Lake Mead and making the politicians look like geniuses. But one good winter does not reverse a 20-year trend of aridification. It does not refill a reservoir that is still more than 150 feet below full pool. It does not change the science, which clearly shows the region getting hotter and the river flows continuing to decline over the long term. The system is built for a climate that no longer exists. The silence from the government is not just about a few feet of water in a reservoir. It is the quiet admission that the old model is broken, the belief that we could engineer our way out of any problem, that we could command the natural world to bend to our economic ambitions. That entire philosophy is being tested in real time on the banks of the Colorado. The dam was a promise of abundant power, of endless growth, of a permanent civilization carved into a hostile landscape. For a long time, that promise was kept. But what happens when the premises of the promise are revealed to have been false? The river was never as wet as they thought. The population grew far beyond their wildest projections. The climate, which they assumed was stable, began to change in ways their models could not predict. The dam itself has not failed. Its concrete is sound, its design is robust. Humanity has failed. Our math was wrong. Our appetites were too large. Our political systems too slow and too fractured to react to a slow-motion catastrophe until it becomes a high-speed emergency. The image of the silent turbines is powerful, not just for the power they will no longer produce, but for what they represent. They are the gears of a machine that worked for an American West that no longer exists. They were built for a river of the past. Today, they are relics waiting for a tide that may never return. When those 12 units spin to a halt, it will be an auditory and electrical funeral for an entire era of water management. The hum of progress replaced by the silence of consequence. We look at the bathtub ring on the walls of Lake Mead, that 170-foot tall chalky scar, and we see it as a measure of loss. But it is also a growth chart, a marker of our own unsustainable expansion. Each foot of that ring represents millions of people, thousands of acres of farms, entire cities that were built on the assumption that the water would always be there. Looking at it now, from the bottom up, it seems less like a bathtub ring and more like a high watermark of an empire that overreached. A civilization that flew too close to the sun, in a desert where the sun always wins. The engineers did their jobs. They built the dam. There is a flaw etched into the concrete heart of Hoover Dam. Not a crack, not a sign of age, but a deliberate design choice made a century ago that is about to become a catastrophic failure. A choice that could stop the Colorado River dead in its tracks. The dam's lowest release valves, the steel gates that pass water downstream to California, Arizona, and Mexico, are positioned high on the canyon wall. If Lake Mead drops below 895 feet above sea level, those gates will sit above the water line. The dam will still be holding back millions of acre-feet of water, but it will be physically incapable of releasing a single drop. The water will be trapped, a prisoner of the very structure built to control it. And the system that provides water to 40 million people and underpins a $1.4 trillion economy will simply stop. The situation is far more complex than a simple drought. Let us know in the comments if you see this as a failure of engineering or a failure of foresight. This isn't a distant possibility. It's a number on a chart that federal officials are watching right now, and it is not the only number that matters. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed. If you believe this kind of reporting is critical, please take 1 second to hit that button. It is a small click that guarantees you won't miss the next development in this crisis, and it allows us to continue making these deep dives. Now let's get back to it. Long before the river turns off completely, the lights go out. There is another, higher line in the water that engineers fear almost as much. An elevation of 950 feet. It's called the minimum power pool. Below this line, Hoover Dam's massive hydroelectric turbines, the ones that generate power for 1.3 million people, have to be shut down. Not because there's no water, but because the water that's left will tear them apart. The phenomenon is called cavitation. When water pressure drops too low, something terrifying happens inside the turbines. The water literally begins to boil. Not from heat, but from the lack of pressure. It forms vapor bubbles. These bubbles aren't harmless. They are microscopic vacuums that travel with the flow of water until they reach a higher pressure zone. And then they collapse. Violently. The collapse is called an implosion, And it happens with such concentrated force that it generates shockwaves strong enough to rip chunks of metal off the turbine blades. Imagine thousands of tiny hammer blows, striking the steel every second. It sounds like gravel being churned through machinery, and the destruction is just as brutal. An operator who runs a turbine in cavitation isn't just risking damage. They are actively destroying a critical piece of American infrastructure. So they can't. They won't. Below 950 feet, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation has no choice. The turbines go silent. The flow of electricity to cities in Nevada, Arizona, and California is severed, not reduced. Severed. A city like Phoenix could lose a significant portion of its power, not because of a storm or a grid failure, but because of a water level measurement taken hundreds of miles away. This is the impossible choice facing Ems Camille Kalemlim Tutin, the Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation. Appointed in 2021, she is the lead federal official managing a crisis that was set in motion before she was born. Every projection, every water flow model crosses her desk, and every model shows the 950-foot line getting closer. In May of 2026, the Bureau invested $52 million for new turbines, machines specifically optimized to work in the dangerously low water levels that are now the new reality. It was an admission, a quiet acknowledgement that the world the dam was built for is gone, and the machinery of the 20th century is no longer fit for the 21st. The debate over whether to prioritize power generation or water releases downstream is no longer theoretical. It's a real-time battle over dwindling resources. Who should get the last drops? The cities that need power or the farms that need water? It's a question with no right answer. The fatal flaw wasn't a mistake made during construction. It was an error made in a hotel room in Santa Fe, New Mexico, more than a decade before the first bucket of concrete was ever poured. It was a math problem. On November 24, 1922, representatives from 7 states gathered to sign the Colorado River Compact. They were men of their time, driven by ambition and an unquestioned faith in manifest destiny. Men like Elwood Mead, the Reclamation Commissioner, whose name would one day be given to the reservoir itself. Their task was to divide the river, to allocate its seemingly infinite flow and pave the way for the growth of the American West. They based their calculations on the best data they had. Flow measurements taken over the preceding 2 decades. And those decades were wet, unusually, historically wet. The river gauges showed an average annual flow of 16, maybe even 18 million acre-feet of water. So they took that number, carved it up, and signed a document that promised 15 million acre-feet per year to the states of the basin. It was the foundational document for a century of development, a legal promise etched in paper. And it was built on a lie. The river was never that wet. Scientists would later use paleoclimatology, the study of tree rings, to reconstruct the river's flow over hundreds of years. The rings told a different story, a story of a much drier, more volatile river. The true long-term average flow wasn't 16 million acre-feet. It was closer to 12 or 13 million. The river, in legal terms, was already bankrupt before Hoover Dam even existed. The compact had promised water that the river simply did not have to give. When construction began in Black Canyon in 1931, nobody knew. The chief engineer, a man named Francis Trenholm Crowe, or Frank Crowe, was a force of nature. He was tasked with taming a river, and he did it with brutal efficiency. His motto was speed. He drove his crews relentlessly, inventing new techniques on the fly to get the job done faster and under budget. He finished the dam 2 years ahead of schedule. On March 1st, 1936, the colossal structure was handed over to the federal government, a 726-foot tall monument to humanity's power to dominate nature. But it was a monument built on the flawed assumptions of 1922. The placement of the penstocks, the height of the outlets, the capacity of the turbines. Every decision was based on the vision of a bountiful river, a river that could fill a reservoir to 1,219.6 feet above sea level and keep it there. For a while, it seemed to work. In July of 1983, the dream was more than real. After a series of wet winters, Lake Mead reached its all-time peak elevation. Water poured over the dam's spillways for the first time, a spectacular display of abundance. A confirmation of Crow's and Mead's vision. It was the last time it would ever happen. The year 2000 marked the beginning of the end of that world, the start of a mega drought, the worst the region has seen in 1,200 years, supercharged by a warming climate, and the lake began to fall. The iconic white bathtub ring appeared on the canyon walls. It's not scum or residue. It's calcium carbonate, thick mineral deposits baked onto the sandstone, a stark geological scar marking how much has been lost, foot by foot, year by year. The water debt that had been accumulating silently since 1922 was finally coming due. As the lake receded, it exposed history. The foundations of St. Thomas, a town submerged in 1938. Decades-old shipwrecks. It was as if the lake was giving up its dead as it died. By July of 2022, the water level hit its historic record low, 1,040 feet. The promises of 1922 had met the reality of 2022, and reality was winning. The fight over this water is pitting state against state, city against city. The crisis isn't just about Hoover Dam, it's about the entire system. If you believe this information is vital, hitting the like button and sharing this video helps more people understand just how connected this crisis really is. The fate of Lake Mead is not decided at Hoover Dam. It is decided 250 miles upstream at the foot of another concrete behemoth, Glen Canyon Dam. The dam holds back Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir, and its health is directly tied to Mead's. The entire Colorado River system is a cascade. Water released from Powell flows down the Grand Canyon and becomes the inflow for Mead. For decades, that relationship was stable. Not anymore.
Lake Powell is in its own death spiral. Currently sitting at roughly 25% capacity, its own turbines are facing the same threat of cavitation. Its own water levels are approaching a point of no return. To save Glen Canyon Dam, the Bureau of Reclamation has been forced into an act of desperation. They have started withholding water, robbing Peter to pay Paul. In recent planning, federal managers announced they would slash releases from Lake Powell by nearly 1.5 million acre-feet. That water, which should be flowing downstream to replenish Lake Mead, is now being held back in a desperate attempt to keep Glen Canyon's turbines spinning. It is a triage decision on a continental scale, and the consequences for Hoover Dam are immediate and severe. This single action is projected to accelerate Lake Mead's decline dramatically. The water that was supposed to buffer against the worst-case scenarios is gone. The projections are stark. This reduction in inflow is expected to slash Hoover Dam's own hydropower output by as much as 40% by late 2026. A 40% drop. It's a number so large it verges on the abstract, but its effects will be concrete. Rolling blackouts, skyrocketing electricity prices, an energy crisis born from a water crisis. What's happening is a slow-motion catastrophe, a domino effect engineered into the very system designed to prevent it. We built two giants, believing they would support each other. Instead, they are now pulling each other down. Each dam's survival comes at the direct expense of the other. The managers of the system are no longer managing for growth or stability. They are managing for failure, trying to decide which part of the system dies first. This terrible choice highlights the fundamental flaw of the entire arrangement. The system was built for abundance. It has no elegant way to handle scarcity. It just breaks down, piece by piece, as the managers are forced to sacrifice one part to temporarily save another. The choice to save Powell's power dooms Mead's. And as Mead drops faster, it races toward its own twin red lines, the 950-foot power pool and the 895-foot dead pool. The upstream decision has effectively put a timer on the entire lower basin, a timer that is now counting down much, much faster. In the middle of the driest desert in North America sits a city that has always known this day was coming, Las Vegas, a metropolis of 2.3 million people.
that gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead. And it is, paradoxically, the most secure city in the entire American West. While other states were trusting in a century-old compact, Las Vegas was preparing for the apocalypse. John J. Ensminger, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, or SNWA, saw the writing on the wall years ago. He understood that conservation alone, while critical, wouldn't solve a problem of infrastructure. The existing water intakes, built in 1971 and 2000, were located at 1,050 and 1,000 feet, respectively. As the lake fell, they were becoming obsolete. In June 2026, Lake Mead slipped below the 1,050-foot mark, rendering the original intake number 1 entirely useless, exposed to the open air. Las Vegas was watching its lifeline evaporate. So they did something audacious. They decided to build an escape hatch. The project was called Intake Number 3 and the Low Lake Level Pumping Station. It cost $1.5 billion. It was a plan born of pure necessity. The goal was to drill a new tunnel, a third straw, that would pull water from the very bottom of the lake. Not near the bottom. The bottom. At an elevation of 875 feet. That number is critical. 875 feet. It is below the 895-foot dead pool threshold of Hoover Dam. Think about what that means. When the lake level drops so low that the dam can no longer release water to California and Arizona, when the Colorado River effectively stops at the Nevada border, Las Vegas will still be able to pump water. They built a drain in the bottom of the bathtub. The engineering was monumental. It required carving a massive cavern deep into the bedrock beneath the lake. From there, they sank a 535-foot deep access shaft and installed 34 submersible pumps, each weighing up to 79 tons. These pumps are capable of moving 900 million gallons of water a day, pulling it from the deepest part of the lake and sending it to the city. Construction finished in April 2020. In April 2022, as the lake level plunged, they turned it on for good. While farmers in Arizona and politicians in California were staring at the prospect of a complete cutoff, Las Vegas had quietly bought its own survival. It has been called the world's most expensive insurance policy. John Ensminger has been blunt about their position. In March of 2026, he said, "We are thoroughly prepared to fight like hell. If it comes to fighting to protect the water interests of Southern Nevada, we're ready. This isn't just about infrastructure. It's about power. Las Vegas, through sheer engineering and political will, has secured its water supply even in a dead pool scenario. They have decoupled their fate from the fate of the states downstream. When the day comes that Hoover Dam's gates are high and dry, the fountains on the Las Vegas Strip may be the only part of the lower Colorado system that still has water. It is a stunning display of foresight, and it creates a moral hazard of terrifying proportions. Las Vegas may survive. But it will survive by drinking the water that everyone else was counting on. The engineering is finished. The physical battle against the lake has been fought. Now the real war begins. It's being waged not with drills and concrete, but with lawyers and policy papers in closed-door meetings between 7 states, 2 countries, and the federal government. The arena is the renegotiation of the Colorado River's operating rules. The existing framework, the 2007 Interim Guidelines, expires on December 31st, 2026. After that date, without a new agreement, there are no rules. And the system could descend into chaos. The negotiations for the post-2026 operations are deadlocked. It's a high-stakes standoff with the future of the Southwest on the line. In one corner, you have the lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada. They historically used the most water and are now facing the most severe cuts. In the other corner are the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. They feel they have a right to develop their share of the river, water that was allocated to them in 1922, but which they have not yet fully used. The players are dug in. J.B. Hamby, the Colorado River Commissioner for California, represents the state with the largest and oldest water rights in the basin, a colossal 4.4 million acre-feet per year. He holds the best cards, and is reluctant to fold. He stated the problem plainly in February 2026. Our real issue is not that we've run out of time. The problem is that we don't have sufficient compromise all around. Then there is Brenda Berman, the general manager of the Central Arizona Project and a former commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation herself. Arizona stands to lose the most under some proposed federal cuts, which would devastate its agricultural sector and burgeoning high-tech industries. Her position is defiant. Our message is clear, she said. The Diaz alternatives threaten to tear apart a generation of careful water management. She calls the federal proposals that would disproportionately impact her state unacceptable. And in the middle is Nevada, represented by John Ensminger, who has already built his state's lifeboat with the Low Lake level pumping station, giving him a unique and powerful position at the table. The lower basin states, in a rare moment of unity, put forward a joint proposal in May 2026. The plan is to conserve an additional 3.2 million acre-feet of water by 2028, a massive cutback designed to prop up the reservoirs and stave off federal intervention. But the upper basin sees this as the lower basin, trying to solve a problem of its own making, while still consuming the lion's share of the river. The federal government, led by Commissioner Touton, looms over the entire process, threatening to impose its own solution if the states cannot agree. That is a scenario no one wants, as it would likely lead to decades of litigation. The states are fighting over a shrinking pie, each trying to protect their own interests, all while the pie itself is baked by a climate that is getting hotter and drier every year. The negotiations are no longer about dividing abundance. They are about allocating scarcity. And no one wants to be the one who has to tell their citizens that the water is gone. This story is unfolding in real time, with the future of 40 million people hanging in the balance. We are committed to tracking every development. I know we've mentioned it before, but with a crisis this complex, it's easy for updates to get lost in the noise. So many people who value this reporting forget to subscribe. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in the outcome. Please take that 1 second. It ensures you won't miss our follow-up when these critical negotiations reach their breaking point. So, where does this end? The uncomfortable truth is that it may not. The engineering marvels of the 20th century are being overwhelmed by the environmental realities of the 21st. We are facing a problem that may not have a purely technical solution. The latest 24-month study from the Bureau of Reclamation, released in May 2026, offers a grim forecast. It projects that Lake Mead could plunge to 1,020 feet by July 2027. This would be a new, shocking all-time low, blowing past the previous record set in 2022. It would put the lake just 70 feet above the minimum power pool and dangerously close to a complete shutdown of hydropower. These are not worst-case scenarios from a distant climate model. These are the federal government's own operational projections for the immediate future. The system is flashing red alerts. The response has been a series of desperate, short-term fixes. The $52 million investment in new low-head turbines at Hoover Dam is a perfect example. It's a reactive, not a proactive, measure. It's an attempt to retrofit a dying system, to squeeze the last few kilowatts out of a retreating lake, rather than addressing the core imbalance between what the river provides and what we demand from it. The very concept of the dam as a symbol of permanent control over nature is being tested. For a century, Hoover Dam stood as a testament to human ingenuity. Now, it stands as a testament to its limits. The fatal flaw, the outlets being too high, isn't just a technical issue, it's a philosophical one. It represents a failure of imagination. The builders, in all their brilliance, simply could not imagine a world where the water would fall this far. They could not conceive of a river that would betray their calculations so completely. And beneath the falling water levels, a separate threat is building. As the lake shrinks, the concentration of minerals and salts in the remaining water increases. Water quality degrades. Furthermore, the shrinking lake exposes shorelines contaminated with legacy pollutants from decades of industrial activity. Every foot the lake drops risks remobilizing these toxins. Las Vegas's third straw may guarantee them access to water, but it doesn't guarantee that the water will be clean. We are drifting into uncharted territory. The old rules no longer apply. The old infrastructure is revealing its hidden failures. The states are locked in a political prisoner's dilemma, where the rational choice for each individual state is to protect its own interests, leading to a collectively catastrophic outcome. Federal proposals to radically replumb the system, even talking about bypassing Glen Canyon Dam entirely to let the river run more freely, show how profoundly the thinking has shifted. The era of giant centralized dams may be coming to an end. The final question isn't about engineering. It's not about whether we can drill another tunnel or build a higher dam. The question is one of acceptance. Can 40 million people in an arid land accept the truth that the river is not what they were promised? Can a $1.4 trillion economy adapt to a future with less water? The third straw bought Las Vegas time. The record snowpack of 2023 bought the whole basin time. Time for conservation to take hold. Time for policy to catch up with physics. Time for a new agreement to be forged. But that time is running out. The dam stands silent watch over a diminishing lake. The concrete flaw, designed in 1922, is waiting.